All right.
All right. I'll admit everyone in now.
Hi, Olive.
Good morning, Ella.
Hello.
So
Hello.
excited to be here.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
setting this up. You made it. We made it. We all made it.
Thanks to you, John.
With more people. I saw Greg Stevens on the screen even. This is great.
Thank you.
You're
for all
keeping
the
up with
work you
your
did.
commitments, John.
I know. I try. Modest though they may be.
This is the best part of my year, Elif.
Okay, I'm gonna do something here. I cannot. I'm gonna stop sharing because I cannot. The slide mode for some reason. My slide mode.
Hmm.
You might have to try to, even though you can't see it, try to take your cursor on top of your presentation and click.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Hello, John. It's nice seeing you after last year.
Who's talking? I can't see.
Nancy Nesvet.
Oh, good to see you.
Good to see you. Yeah. And let me see. I'm wearing my I voted button on purpose. Yeah.
Nancy, in North Carolina, they are not giving out I voted buttons. They're giving out pens for you to vote with.
Yeah.
And they say I voted early because that's how nobody's touching the screen. They're using their pens to vote with.
Yesterday, I was given the choice of a paper ballot, which I took.
Oh.
And then when I left, actually, I got 4 stickers because my son-in-law and daughter are in Wisconsin. Yeah, and even though they voted early, by sending it in, and my husband put it in a Dropbox. So I'm the only one who gets stickers. So I got for everyone.
Excellent.
Well, and here in Arlington, where Elif and I live, it was paper ballots. That was all that was the offering.
That's a great idea, actually. I mean, when they said,
and then you scan them yourself.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I did it is because if you make a mistake, you just bring it up and they give you a new one. It's not like fiddling around with a computer.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hi, John.
Hi, who's that? I can't see the speakers when you speak.
Oh, it's Susan Norton.
Oh, hi, Susan.
Good to see you after these many months.
It's great to have everybody back and new people and people who've been with us. This is fantastic.
Yep.
And all compliments to Elif for keeping us
absolutely
moving forward. Oh, there's
and
Carly.
boy, do we need empathy more than ever.
A very well-timed event, yes.
Absolutely.
Hi, everybody. Good to see you.
Hi. We can't see your video. Do you want to turn it on?
Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on. I was just in another meeting, so let me figure that out.
You're good.
Can you see me now? Okay.
Yeah. Thanks.
Big crowd.
Mm-hmm.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, everyone.
I guess we'll give it another minute.
Mhm.
How are we doing in terms of the people?
I see 52 are here.
Okay,
Great.
give it one more minute. And I think it seems like we're almost stable now in terms of people coming in.
Mhm.
Believe this is great seeing everybody sign in from different countries around. You've got a global conference. It used to be we went somewhere. Now everyone's coming to you, Elif.
That's right. This turned out to be an international one for sure. Thanks to you for
Well,
allowing
keep
us to use your Zoom.
signing in, everybody. This is terrific, seeing everybody, where everybody's logging in from.
Yeah, those who are coming from different countries and different time zones, please drop a line in the chat and say hello and let us know where you're participating from. So with that, should we begin? Because it's already 5 minutes. Well, welcome to the 3rd annual Designing for Empathy Summit, Shaping the Future of Empathy Building. I would like to thank, oops. Now I cannot move my slides. 1 second. Okay, thank you. I would like to thank all the partners, participants, and presenters for being here. Without you, truly, this event would not be possible. I also would like to acknowledge people coming from different time zones. Please drop a line and tell us where you're participating from. Especially, I would like to thank the leadership of the George Washington University and the museum and the Textile Museum, the Dalai Lama Center for Transformative Values and Ethics, and Woodland Park Zoo, Museum of Us, and the Creativity and Emotions Lab at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. And special thanks go out to our event team. And if they can, when I announce their name, if they can just say hello to everyone. Lori Karshner from the GW Textile Museum.
Hello, thank you. I'm happy to be part of the summit this year.
Thank you so much, Lori. And she will be our timer throughout today. And Laurel Abbots from the Woodland Park Zoo.
Hello, everyone. I'm also really excited to be here.
Thank you. I'm really grateful to both of your hard work. Without your hard work and guidance, I wouldn't be here. I couldn't be here because I wouldn't be able to find my way around this system. So really much appreciated. Also, a big thanks to Greg Stevens, who will moderate our questions and answers today throughout the summit. Greg, would you like to say a few words?
I would. Thank you so much, Elif, and it's my honor to be a part of this program. As Elif mentioned, I will be monitoring the chat box throughout the day for each day of the summit. So please feel free to engage with each other and with our presenters by typing in your thoughts or questions or comments into the chat box. And we'll take a pause periodically for Q&A. At the end of the day, Elif and I will engage in a conversation wrapping up the major themes for each day. We do want to offer just a couple of quick reminders to you. If you would like during any presentation to use the speaker view button in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. That way you can focus only on the speaker presenting at that time. Thanks a lot, Elif.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you. And the last but not the least, I would like to thank my brother, Fatih Mehmet Durmuş, who provides all my logos and visuals and including all the graphics design at this event. So thank you. And so I will, okay, thank you very much. I guess my move button is working now. So we have an amazing group of speakers. Today on day one, we will talk about the evolving meaning of empathy. During the last minutes, as Greg said, we will invite participants to the very first summit in 2018 to share their commitments and insights from that experience. And on next slide, please. On day two, we will focus on we will explore empathy through the lenses of leadership, values, dialogue, and design. And on, on day three, we will discuss the relationship between empathy, meaning making, and emotional well-being. Again, during the last 30 minutes of our last day, I will invite the participants from 2019 summit and also this year's participants to share a few words and share their commitments and insights moving forward. But first, some housekeeping items. So you are provided with a unique Zoom link for each day. This link will be valid throughout the day. So please, as you know that we have a break in the middle, but please return to the same link after lunch break. And if you're having any technical difficulties, please reach out to Laurel and Lori. And Greg, if you please could drop their contact information in the chat, that would be great. And the event is being recorded. Please keep your camera on to help keep a sense of community in the virtual world. And daily recordings of the event will be shared at my website, elifgökçiğdem.com, after the event. And as mentioned, Greg Stevens will moderate all of our questions. So please drop any questions you might have in the chat, and Greg will moderate and curate and deliver them to the presenters. To allocate maximum time for our speakers, we will not have formal introductions for the speakers. Please refer to the bios document you were provided with to get their background information. It was included in your welcome package. And we've had a few new participants in the last few days. So an updated bios list is included in a shared folder, which I hope now Greg can drop in the chat box so everyone can access these documents. And the shared folder actually has all the documents that you have received in your welcome package. So a few reminders for the presenters. If you have any slides, please remember to be ready to share your screen a few minutes prior to your turn. And I will briefly announce your name, and then you will start sharing your screen. If you have no slides, simply unmute and you're ready to go. As mentioned, Lori will be our timekeeper today, and every day our timekeeper will change, and she's waving at us. And please make her permanently displayed on your screen. This is especially critical for the speakers, so that you can track your remaining time. She has prompts prepared for like 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 2 minutes to remind you of your remaining time. And this is how you can do this. So if you just hover your cursor around her visual right now on her picture, and then there's an option that will come up, pin, and then she will become a permanent friend of you for the day. And so as mentioned, everyone should have received a welcome package, and this included the agenda for the summit with all the timings for each speaker and bios. As mentioned, updated version is in the shared folder. There was a flyer. Please, use it to promote the event on your social media. And we also had daily speaker announcements. Any of these documents you are welcome to share within your networks. And in the welcome package also, there were two forms. One is a bookshelf form. This is for if you wish to share any resources, any books or websites that are relevant to our discussions, please drop in their information. I've started the list with a few book recommendations from my knowledge, and please, I welcome to see more. And the commitments form, which I will discuss next, because it's an essential part of the Designing for Empathy Summit. Again, there's a form for that, but I will also open the floor to discussion on the day first and day third to hear from few participants about their experiences and ideas. And on the last day of the summit, you will also receive an evaluation form, which I hope you will all fill out and return. So just to give you a little bit background of the commitments aspect of the summit. So all participants and speakers to the Designing for Empathy Summit are encouraged to make and share at least one commitment or idea related to empathy building that they will turn it into action. Just to give you a background information, the first Empathy Summit with Dalai Lama in 2018 resulted in 3 commitments the group made collectively. These 3 commitments lie at the heart of the Designing for Empathy Summit and are repeated every year. Our collective commitments as Designing for Empathy Summit participants this year would include the following: convene every year for a 3-day of collective learning experience, make at least one commitment each and turn it into action, and pass it on. Find ways to pass on the knowledge gained from this community. Your individual commitment could be at a very personal level and you don't have to share with anyone, or it could be at an institutional scale or might require a collaboration with others participating in this summit. In this case, please do let us know. The key is to take action and turn our ideas into action. That's the key element. With that, I'd like to make an announcement about my commitment from 2018. It was actually an expectation from the group that's participated in that summit for me to turn this initiative into a nonprofit. So it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you One, Organization of Networks for Empathy, which is currently waiting for its nonprofit status. I could not have turned this idea into action without the guidance and support of my co-founders and advisors, Zorana Ivsevich Pringle and Michelle Cedars. And thank you so much again. And you will hear more from us with this development. I think next year, the Empathy Summit will be under the umbrella of One. And if you would like to know more and would like to get involved, please do get in touch. At this time, especially for those who are participating in the summit for the first time, I would like to give a very quick overview of where, when the Empathy Summit Empathy Building Initiative started. This is basically empathy building through museums initiative, which aims to promote empathy as an intentional outcome of a museum experience emerged around 2013. Since 2016, the initiative produced 2 books that include contributed chapters and 2 summits with Empathy Summit with Dalai Lama, and then last year at the Phillips Collection at GW Museum. So, and here we are. So it brings us here today at our virtual summit. So why do we do this work, right? So I would like to give you a little bit background about my understanding of empathy. Empathy is our ability to share another's feelings and imagine that what it would feel like to be them. As we put ourselves in another's shoes, we are inspired to take action to alleviate the other's problem because we think this could have been me in this situation. Empathy lies at the heart of our ability to connect with another. Research tells us that empathy can be learned and can be nurtured as if exercising a muscle. We can build our empathy to be more nuanced and sophisticated. In a way, empathy gives us triple focus. It inspires us to examine our internal world of emotions and helps us to get to know ourselves through the other as a mirror, where we can explore what we are truly made of, our thoughts, our aspirations, emotions, how we make choices, and our biases. This self-knowledge allows us to see the humanity in others and expands our circle of empathy to those who may be very different from us. Empathy does not mean that one has to agree with others all the time, but it is hoped that it would help create a common denominator of a basic understanding of our shared humanness and our interconnectedness. Then it becomes possible for us to expand our circle of concern from beyond those who are immediately around us, who tend to look and think like us, to others who may be very different from us, live in another part of the world where we may never even encounter them in our lifetimes. Empathy's expanding circle has the capacity to include all of humanity and our planet with all living beings and all things in existence. The way we see it is the way we live it. If we think we are separate, standalone, independent beings, independent from each other, we fail to see the whole of which we are all a part. This fragmented worldview then finds its reflection in our destructive choices, attitudes, and behaviors towards ourselves and those of around us, and also our environment. On the other hand, when we see ourselves as integral to something greater than ourselves, we tend to calibrate and harmonize our actions and behavior accordingly. Only through a realization of interconnectedness or oneness, we find meaning, hope, and purpose in life and act with compassion and altruism towards the whole, all of humanity and the planet. I call this the oneness mindset, and empathy is a portal into this oneness mindset. Oneness as a concept is nothing new. Just like empathy, it has many names and many faces depending on the cultural context. It has many names including unity, non-duality, interconnectedness, interdependence, interbeing, Ubuntu, Advaita, Wahdat al-Wujud are only a few of these names. In our meeting with His Holiness with Dalai Lama, this is how he described oneness. It is a sense of oneness of 7 billion human beings. I consider 7 billion human beings are the same human beings. Basically, same brothers and sisters. National and religious differences are secondary. Basically, we are same human being. The way we are born, the way we survive with mother's milk are the same. Physically, mentally, emotionally, 7 billion human beings are the same. I always think it that way. To create happy family, trust and compassion are the key. Then you develop more warm-heartedness. Then human beings' unique intelligence is further utilized to further strengthen this warm-heartedness. Intelligence and warm-heartedness combined, then we can develop infinite love that no other animal cannot. He also said this: one person's warm-heartedness shared with 10, each 10 shared with 100, then 1,000. This is the way to change our community and finally humanity through education. I think there's a very good potential through education, humanity would become more compassionate. This century should be hopefully compassionate century. Then nonviolence will automatically come. Empathy is like a seed. It is not the end product. It is not the tree. It is only a tool or a portal through which we can explore and expand our human capacities. When you have a seed, it is important to know in which type of soil it should be planted, what other plants should be around it to nurture it, and what other plants should be avoided to suck its energy, and how much sun or rain it should get. I believe that the oneness mindset An understanding and an appreciation of our interconnectedness is the best context and the most fertile grounds for empathy to grow, so that it may lead to altruism, compassion, and ultimately love. It is only hope that empathy would lead to love. The goal of the Designing for Empathy Summit and our role here as the tens, hundreds, and thousands, as Dalai Lama calls us, is to make an effort that it does. So in a nutshell, this is a snapshot of how Empathy Building Through Museums initiative led to our gathering here today at this virtual Designing for Empathy Summit, and some of the questions that continue to drive its journey. I would like to end my remarks with a simple saying in Turkish. We say aşk olsun, may it be love, may it become love. So my little sentiments for the day: may all of our intentions, efforts, and actions at this very moment become love. Thank you again for being here. I'm so grateful for your presence. With that, please welcome our first presenter and performer, Amelia Winger-Bearskin, artist, technologist, and a participant to our very first Empathy Summit to Dalai Lama. Amelia, the floor is yours, and I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you so much, Elif. I'm so grateful to be here today. I'm just going to let you know that I am Seneca Cayuga Nation of Oklahoma, Deer Clan. That means that I'm indigenous or Native American, and I would like to sing to you a Native American spiritual, and I have some live performers with me as well. Thank you so much, Elif. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amelia. And our next speaker, I think, is Venerable Tenzin Priyadarshi. If he's available, maybe we can welcome him.
Good morning. Should I just begin?
Yes, Yes, please. Thank you so much for being here. We truly appreciate your presence. You gave the keynote virtually last year while we were in Washington. You were, I think, in Indonesia, perhaps. And so we are really grateful for your presence and looking forward to your sharing your insights. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for that beautiful beginning to the summit. And oftentimes it happens that when people encounter His Holiness the Dalai Lama and suggest some proposal to him, His Holiness has this wonderful, encouraging presence where he encourages any good work. But then, somebody needs to sort of take the baton and run with the idea and sort of popularize it. So I am especially thankful and congratulate Elif and her colleagues for doing exactly that. And I'm heartened with the formation of One to continue future endeavors of bringing empathy into wider society. I think last year when I had the opportunity to speak to you briefly, I had sort of started with a worrisome statement saying lack of empathy should be viewed as a public health issue. And unfortunately, not much has changed this year in that capacity, that we should still continue to view it as a public health issue and as a precursor to building trust that is deteriorating in our civic society. We must be mindful that any advancement or any progress in civic society can only advance with the speed of trust. It can only advance with the speed of trust that we have for one another. And that speed of trust depends on many factors, and empathy being one of them. There are, of course, several forms of empathy, and there are many experts that you will be hearing from and their experience around different kinds of empathy. But one of the challenges that the Buddhists are often reminding individuals of is that while we should celebrate our ability to be empathy and kind, we should be cautious of becoming self-congratulatory too early. And what I mean by becoming cautious of self-congratulatory too early is that some years ago, during a conversation with a group of neuroscientists, we were celebrating the discovery of mirror neurons. And when we were celebrating the discovery of mirror neurons, they said, well, it's sort of neurologically wired into us, meaning that if something is not miswired in our brain, we are designed to be empathetic creatures, meaning humans by disposition are empathetic individuals. And it's a wonderful idea. It makes many of our work somewhat easy, somewhat palatable, in the sense that there's a disposition. We're not trying to create something unnatural. We're not trying to foster something unnatural. But then you start looking at the events in past recent months, and you ask yourself, what is causing obscuration to such phenomena of mirror neurons, that a white policeman cannot empathize with a person of color, with a person in minority group? And that it is not just, you see, one or two instances, that it becomes a widespread phenomena in some ways. So first thing is to recognize that empathy is precisely that. It is a potential. It is potential to grow, to become kinder, to become more compassionate. That we should not simply celebrate the cognitive ability to be empathetic, we should not simply celebrate the affective side of being empathetic, but that we should use it as a leaping board to explore what the Buddhists refer to as great compassion or unlimited compassion or immeasurable compassion. That this leap might sound like a gigantic leap for many, but it is something that is deeply embedded in this human potential. Oftentimes, we are preoccupied with simply instances of kindness and compassion. We want to perform acts and activities of kindness and compassion, and they are useful. They are useful for training the mind. They're useful for showing that we can engage ordinarily in day-to-day acts of kindness and compassion. But one thing that many of you who were present in Dharamshala may have experienced, a lot of us refer to His Holiness the Dalai Lama with a term of endearment, kundun. Kundun means the presence. The presence implies somebody who has successfully embodied, you see, the beautiful qualities of such virtue, that the person need not just speak about it, the person need not even demonstrate it, that by their sheer presence, you see, that virtue oozes out of their sense of being. And although it may seem like a far-fetched journey to us, but some of you who may have been in that presence and may have been in the presence of other individuals who demonstrate this capacity, this capability, I think the recognition that we all ought to aspire to become compassionate presence in the society that is marred by polarization, that is marred by violent disagreements and so on. That it is not just about occasional acts of kindness or occasional acts of compassion, but more so about how to become an embodiment of such, that how do we become the presence. And each one of us has the capacity to be exactly that, to become a compassionate presence in this society. And that it has different ripples, that your presence, it just doesn't have personal and professional ripples, but it impacts civic society at large. Emotions are contagious, and compassion and kindness are no exception. Some years ago, when we were flying around, Elif, if I'm running over time, just please raise your hand. I can stop at any point. I don't do prepared remarks. So if I might digress, once upon a time, if you recall, there were these things called airplanes, and we used to use that fairly often. And as a monk, one of the things that I do by virtue of training is observe. And I remember being in one of these shuttle flights from Boston to New York or someplace, and it was like any other day of morning flights, that as soon as the plane landed, you will hear unclicking of seatbelts, you will hear Blackberries and iPhones going on, and messages and conversations, and a kind of rush for everybody to get out of that plane. And there was a kind of aggression that you would be greeted with if you were a bit slow and so on. And as it happens in these shuttles, that a lot of people wouldn't check in their bag. It would go into sort of the side of the plane. So you had to come out and wait in the jetway to do that. And the jetway was becoming a very aggressive space where people were sort of, wanting to get their bags fast and just leave. And there was this one gentleman who was bringing the bags from down to the jetway. And then something happened. This other individual, a fellow passenger, puts his phone away and decides to ask this person if he can help him. He helps. And so he brings the bag and he helps him to put the bag in order. Then magically, another person says, "May I be of help?" And very soon, all the phones were put away. And everybody was suddenly in the space of sheer kindness, where each one was offering somebody else's bag beforehand and saying, "Please take this, and so that you can leave first." And this sense that from the space of aggression to the space of shared kindness, all it took was for one individual to interject that space, See, with this presence of mind to say, this person, he may need some help. So we have to recognize that even ordinary instances where we see a kind of pervasiveness in the sense of aggression, in the sense of me first, which sometimes unfortunately becomes the nationalistic ideology, that every individual has the ability to interject that space. Early on, as some of you may be aware, when I was 13 years old, I had the good fortune of hanging out. I call it hanging out because a 13-year-old can barely work, but hanging out with Mother Teresa for a couple of years. And she often used to remind us that not all of us can do great work. Great work meaning that work of great magnitude. But she often used to say, but you can engage in doing small work with great magnitude of kindness. That not all of us need to think of ourselves as exponential change makers. But whatever change that we wish to bring in the society, if we can bring it with this act of kindness, with a sense of kindness, that is important. So I think one of the things that we ought to recognize, we remind ourselves that as we are exploring empathy, we should also start exploring how to become a compassionate presence in this world, how to think about the sense of immeasurability of compassion. And it's not immeasurability in a sort of fantastical sense of immeasurability. It's immeasurability precisely that because it is calling for us to move beyond the tribal sense of empathy. You see, we all have a sense of ease with being empathetic and kind to people who look like us, who speak the same language, who believe in the same things. But that bias-driven empathy is not the kind of empathy that the Buddhists are speaking of, meaning that kindness and compassion as a cultivation requires precisely that, which is to become self-aware of this implicit bias and to be able to step beyond that, such that our sense of compassion is not a function of who is on the receiving end, that it should not be dictated by who the recipients are, that we simply enact compassion in a manner that is beyond this kind of tribal tetherings. Otherwise, we simply become kind and compassionate in a given community, and in a world so interdependent as ours, so connected as ours, we increasingly need to think about how to move beyond this tribal sense of things. So maybe I'll take a pause here, and again, I'm heartened by this event. I'm heartened by the gathering of these individuals, and thank you for making efforts in whatever capacity that you're doing this. It is a work of urgency, but it also requires a tremendous sense of patience. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to this particular work. We all need to do our part, and I think we can all envision and imagine what a more kind and compassionate world might look like. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much. Greg, I will leave the floor to you, please.
Thank you so much, Elif, and thank you, Venerable Priyadarshi, for those moving and enlightening words. We did have a comment here in the chat box that I think might connect with what you're talking about, moving beyond the tribal mindset. On one hand, what you were talking about was building community, and you're also talking about moving beyond the community that might be the tribal community, the people who look like us. Might you talk a bit about how we might envision a broader community beyond the tribal?
Thank you. I think you have to understand that tribalism is simply an evolutionary function of society, a social evolution. So there's nothing, quote unquote, inherently wrong with tribal sense and the formation of community. But when you get to a stage where you live in a world which is as complex, as heterogeneous as ours, where different belief systems come to become part of the society, different value systems come to become part of the society. You have to start asking yourself that, yes, preservation of certain fabrics of community building is important, but you need to start to think about of ourselves as being part of the larger sense, which His Holiness the Dalai Lama often reminds us of, the family of 7 billion. That otherwise we'll simply become kind of these isolated self-preservation blobs of individual communities, you see, that is more deeply sort of rooted in the sentiments of preservation of community. You see, you have to understand something, it's like porcupinal tendencies. You see, when communities become porcupines, you see, where every time there's a perceived threat and the needles go out, you see, that kind of sentiments for community is not healthy for the interconnected and interdependent world that we live in. That it's not just our economies are interdependent, that our boundaries are interdependent, our sense of well-being is interdependent. And in this evolutionary function, we have to ask ourselves, what are the aspects of community building that we ought to preserve and perpetuate versus what are the things that we actually need to grow beyond? And empathy is one of those important tools that we need to think about.
Thank you so much. And a very interesting metaphor, porcupinal tendencies, as Jim pointed out, might be my new favorite phrase. And it clearly makes so much sense in describing some of the situations that are taking place in our society. Nancy asked a little bit ago in regards to tribalism. What does tribalism have to do, or how does it impact the land, the physical land on which we reside? If you have any thoughts about that.
I think, again, it is important to recognize that historically, when tribes evolved, and if they were not nomadic, and in certain cases, even they were nomadic, they did have a sense of land. They had a sense of, attachment in a positive sense to the land that they could return to, they would come back to. And it was sort of the root of them, as in the tribe, being grounded. And much of that still is true, that we, despite of the cosmopolitan identities that we tend to assume, we all have the sense of where we are rooted, and so on. And so I think, now when we are thinking about our sentiments towards the land, we should think more in terms of preserving the sanctity of that land. You see, that it should not simply become an aspect of nation identity. It should become more an aspect of how do we preserve the sanctity of that land, so that the land remains unexploited in certain ways. You see. So there are different forms of identity that we have with this sense of land. Meaning, what's the point of being, being a stationary tribe that is attached to the land, that is simply engaging in acts of exploitation such as mining and fracking and destroying the climate? You see, we destroy the sanctity of land for short-term profits. Those are the things that we need to become especially mindful of. But again, importantly, you have to recognize, as St. Francis of Assisi often used to say, that the entire world is my cloister, the entire world is my monastery, meaning that the interdependence and the fluidity of the world that we live in today, that wherever you are, that is your land. Meaning the best you can do as an individual is represent the best values of the tribe and the land that you are from, and root it and plant it in where you are coming to. And that's something that we have to continue to recognize. Otherwise, you see, no matter what we invent and what we discover, what we develop, you see, this sense of tribalism will continue to bring us to certain forms of the unfriendly primitive reality. Not all primitivity is unfriendly, but look at social media, you see, as a platform. All it has done in many ways has augmented our sense of tribalism. Who would have thunk that we would use technology as a way to augment our tribal behavior? The worst of it, not the best of it, but the worst of it. You see, so this is something that we ought to become more mindful of. And we as humans, you see, are only, again, as good as our ability to self-correct. If we stop the process of self-correction, we hinder our ability to grow. If we hinder our ability to grow, we hinder our ability to flourish. If we hinder our ability to flourish, we deprive ourselves of the joy of this deep recognition of interconnectedness and interbeing that this planet often invites us to be in.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that you mentioned our use of social media, which often becomes a platform for us to vent and share our thoughts, our political ideology. But it also has a lot of danger that comes with it. Tom is curious to know, what can we do about developing empathy across some of those lines of polarization? And more specifically, how do we develop the ability and tendency to love those who are harder for us to love for whatever reason?
You see, first thing to recognize is that everybody's unique. It's not a matter of pride. You see, it's a matter of recognizing that every individual is unique. You see, somewhere deep down, we all have a tendency that we are special, and that's fine. The challenge happens when we start to think that we are more unique than the other, that we are more special than the other. And then this feeling of superiority and all develops. When that feeling of superiority develops, you see, it already creates an unevenness in relational awareness of how the self relates to the other. Let me give you an example. Okay. Some years ago, I had His Holiness the Dalai Lama come to MIT, and he was giving a talk at Kresge Auditorium. At the end of his remarks, say there were about 1,100 people or so in the audience. At the end of the remarks, one of the students gets up and says, Your Holiness, what do you think of George Bush? George Bush was the president at that time. And His Holiness responds, I love George Bush. Now remember, this is MIT. There was pin drop silence at Kresge. And then His Holiness sort of went on to clarify. And he says, I disagree with his policies. I don't agree with some of his thinking. But I don't deprive him of his humanity. I don't deprive of the sense of friendship that he seeks out. And this is something that, we can all learn from in one way. And I did have one faculty member who actually said that he was so sort of opposed to the idea of George Bush that anytime he heard George Bush's name, he would sort of violently shake, you see, meaning that it would imbalance his sense of emotional stability. And then he said that when the Dalai Lama said this kind of remark, you see, it made me think that, what is it why is it that I get so emotionally imbalanced anytime somebody refers his name and so on? And this is, you see, a deep challenge that we all need to understand, is that perfection is the enemy of good. We live in a human society. Nobody's 100% perfect. But when we simply sort of because of our emotional graspings, amplify the imperfection of certain individuals or amplify the disagreements, you see, which sort of creates this sense of polarization, then we deprive that individual of any goodness. See, you cannot have a meaningful conversation with another individual when you don't perceive even an iota of goodness in that individual, meaning that conversation by its very basis becomes meaningless. You see. So it's important to recognize that particular aspect, to give the benefit of doubt. The second thing that we have to recognize as humans is that we take each other's humanity away the moment we take away the possibility of transformation in the other. To even passively begin to think something like, oh, this person will never change, or that person believes in this thing, they will never evolve out of those ideas. See? We take away the humanity because, again, remember that the very fact that we are human implies that there should be an ability to correct. You see, not everybody corrects themselves at our pace. Not everybody corrects themselves at our will. You see, but we have to maintain this sense that there is a possibility of positive transformation in every individual, and hence the civic society.
Thank you so much. And you mentioned a moment ago the power of emotional imbalance. And Louise commented that emotion is indeed contagious. And given what we are seeing now, how do we rise other voices when neuroscience shows us how much negative experience impresses upon us so much?
Well, I think there is, the positive side of thing is that there is an ability for emotional regulation. Many have demonstrated it successfully, and I think we need to sort of start deeply thinking about it, which is, to start designing tools, to start disseminating tools that allows individuals from very early on to start thinking about how to regulate emotional states, such that we sort of tend to strengthen the virtuous emotional states, the virtuous emotional states of the sense of encouragement, the sense of love, the sense of kindness and compassion, fearlessness, and so on. That we must, again, remember that it's not just about talking about positivity. It's about becoming a positive presence in society. And if each one of us, there are 75 individuals online right now, if each one of us, can make a little effort to become that positive presence, to become that encouraging presence, on a regular basis for people around us, you will also begin to see the contagion aspect of that would have also a kind of ripple effect. And then the challenge is, how do we sustain that ripple effect? And again, it's all doable. The task might look monumentally challenging. It's all doable. But we must, again, begin with ourselves. We shouldn't think about just that, oh, let's change the external environment first. External conditionings are important, but not all variables of external conditioning is within our control. But what is oftentimes within our control is how we condition ourselves.
As you're talking, sir, I think about some business principles in my own practice, and perhaps some of our colleagues in the audience will be familiar with Daniel Goleman's work on emotional intelligence, which at its very core is about understanding ourselves and self-regulation, but also equally about how we communicate that with others. And I think that's very much aligned with what you're talking about here.
Yes. And Daniel Goleman, as you know, has been a long-term sort of conversation partner with the Buddhist group, and one of his books, Destructive Emotions, where he actually says in this conversation with the Dalai Lama that the Dalai Lama kept referring to certain afflictive emotional states as destructive emotions. And Danny was like, why can't we just call it negative emotions? Why can't we just call it sort of, emotions that don't sort of, are not desirable and so on? And His Holiness kept saying destructive emotions and toxic emotions. And you come to recognize that they are indeed destructive and toxic, not just to our own personal sense of well-being, but also to the well-being of civic society. And that's why, at times we may be, in movements such as today, oftentimes we lose the sense of discernment between rage and outrage. You could be outraged, with the sense of injustice, the sense of lack of fairness, the sense of oppression. But to deal with that sense of outrage with rage and confuse the two and conflate the two is not a very useful thing. So oftentimes, we have this tendency of rationalizing when anger is useful, when jealousy is useful in a competitive society, when envy is useful. But deep down, we have to ask ourselves, are those the desirable emotional states that we wish to perpetuate in our life, that we wish to perpetuate in society? Do we want to wake up angry, jealous, and envious? And if not, then we have to recognize that they are actually toxic emotional states. They are actually destructive emotional states. And this is, again, as part of something like emotional literacy, that we must bring it to the forefront of society to understand that everything has an emotional tone. All choices, all perceptions have emotional tone. Politics is entirely emotional tone. And the best way to become active in this world of emotional tones is to dictate what emotional tone are you going to bring into this world. Meaning it's not just about what tone can you get out of this world. Everybody can feel calm and compassionate in a serene environment. The question becomes, what emotional tone are you as an individual, as an organization, as a group going to bring into society? One of my favorite philosophers, Krishnamurti, Jiddu Krishnamurti, he had this retreat place, and the retreat place, there was a meditation, a quiet room, and outside there was a sign that said, do not enter this room expecting to be quiet. Bring the quietness with you. And that's something that we have to be mindful of, you see, that do not enter, do not just think that you're going to be, deriving a sense of joy and satisfaction from the world alone, you see, but to bring in kindness, to bring in compassion, to bring in a sense of joy into the world, into the interactions that you're going to be part of. So take charge of setting the emotional tone at times.
We have just a moment for one more comment and several comments in the chat box. So thank you all for sharing your wonderful thoughts. Sir, a couple of folks have commented about this notion of empathy and emotional oneness is not just about human to human. This is about our interconnectedness really in all aspects of our lives. To the broader sense of our environment and our solar system, really our place in the universe. I wonder if you might close out our comments with a reflection on that.
You see, we as humans have forgotten how to relate to one another, how to relate to the environment, the ecosystem that we are part of. And what I mean that we have forgotten how to relate to one another is that this norm of a consumer mindset has become such that all we know is to consume relationships. All we know is to consume the environment and consume the ecosystem. To the point that even the sanctity of something like a caring relationship or a loving relationship has become purely transactional. If you're radically honest with yourself, you will begin to see, strains of this consumer behavior, of this transactional mindset, even in your most loving and caring relationship. And so we have to ask ourselves, is that all that we are capable of? And not to, you don't have to read the book, but recently I came out with this book called Running Toward Mystery, and it's mostly focused on teaching moments and teachers. And the last chapter of this book is about my conversation with the Arahuaco Mamos in Sierra Nevada in Colombia, the indigenous tribe that I have come to admire so much. And this sense of pain that when we forget how to relate to each other and the kind of pain that it causes is something that we can learn from that particular community, from that particular group. So again, you see, can we challenge ourselves to think beyond transactional notions of relationships?
Thank you so much, Venerable Priyadarshi, for your insight and your wisdom and your generosity of spirit. And of course, thank you to Amelia Winger-Bearskin and your family for sharing a beautiful opening moment with us. Elif, I will turn it back to you now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again. I second all the sentiments from Greg, and thank you, Amelia. Thank you, Venerable Priyadarshi. And I think I put the information, the book information in our bookshelf, but I have your copy, which I hope you will sign one day for me when we can travel again. And I would highly recommend, and it was full of inspiration and insight, and really molds well with what we are talking here today. And with that, I would like to welcome Susan Lanzoni, author of Empathy, a History. And I certainly learned a lot from this book, and it really helped me understand to see the many other descriptions that empathy has. And we had an amazing introduction to it through a performance where we felt empathy without even uttering any words from our end. And Susan, if you are ready, please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Elif, and thank you so much for inviting me to this summit. I'm really excited to be here, and already am getting quite a lot of insight into the deeper meanings of empathy, which I will talk about. I'm going to share my screen and hope all goes well. Let's see. And just let me just get it going. Okay. So again, very pleased to be here. And I've thought about empathy a lot as an historian of science and psychology and neuroscience, and was really interested in how we first even came to the word empathy in English. And it turns out it's a relatively new word. It only first appears in 1908, and British psychologists are translating it. Actually, the field of psychology, experimental psychology, that is fairly new. It's only starts in the end of the 19th century. And what I discovered, and what I'm going to just do in this brief talk, is give a few highlights of this history, just so we can really see the complexity and the variety and diversity of empathy's meanings, and actually the changing meanings over time, which I think really contributes to a deep understanding of what empathy is trying to convey. So I'm going to start back in the early part of the 20th century, when, as I said, around 1908, you first see the term empathy translated as kind of a variant of sympathy. And going back to the Greek, where there is a term, empatheia, but the translation does occur of a German term here, Einfühlung, and that was a term circulating in art history and in psychological aesthetics. And it had a meaning of feeling in, and actually, interestingly, feeling into objects, feeling into art objects. So if you read this one early definition, the power of projecting one's personality into and so fully comprehending the object of contemplation, it's kind of very different from what we think of as empathy today. Firstly, we don't often think of empathy as projection, right? We think, well, it's about the other person. It's not about yourself. You don't want to project your own feelings into the other person. You want to really gauge their feelings. The other is it's a projection into an object. So an object of contemplation. So that again is very different, right? This idea that we empathize with objects, but that was an original meaning, and it was understood as kind of central to the aesthetic response and the appreciation of the beautiful. And here is one big proponent of empathy, Vernon Lee. She took on this masculine name. Her name was Violet Paget. She was a writer, novelist, and she was a prolific writer, and also wrote on empathy as a kind of aesthetic principle. And in this 1913 book, The Beautiful, she writes the best example of empathy is when said that opposing to that man, there was a mountain rising against the sky. And so this is, again, a little counterintuitive to us today, but the notion here is that we take our inner feelings of movement or feeling and we project them. So maybe if you're looking at the mountain, your neck is rising, or you have this thought or feeling, internal feeling, imagination of moving upward. And that's a sort of your own feeling that you then transfer into the mountain. And then the sense is that the mountain itself is rising. So again, it's a subjective, almost animation of the world around us. And again, that was thought to be a principle of the beautiful for a lot of these aestheticians in the early part of the century. So again, it's empathy as kind of immersing ourselves in the world around us. And I've written a little bit about how this is a kind of interesting way to sort of think about perhaps an eco-empathy that we might cultivate today that isn't really often associated necessarily with the empathy for others that we're more familiar with. So just moving from that moment, here's another example of psychologists in the laboratory doing experiments with lines and saying that there was an emotional quality to these lines. So the idea is that the lines that were moving upward with kind of sharp angles were agitated or powerful. The lines that were moving downward were sad or weak. And this kind of projected emotion into line, the emotional quality of lines was also this other, was a way of understanding empathy as a kind of animation of abstract objects, abstract lines. And there's also ways in which some early abstract art was seen as kind of functioning along these empathic lines, or according to the principle of empathy. There's also interesting connections early on with modern dance, which is actually coming into its own in the early part of the 20th century. And this is just an image from Martha Graham, Primitive Mysteries Dance. But the writer, John Martin, who is listed at the bottom here, was a New York Times dance critic. And he was influenced by Vernon Lee and other empathy theorists and talked about how this is how one could appreciate modern art. And an audience member would be sitting in their seat, but in their inner world, they would be imaginatively moving as if they were on the stage. And this was a form of kinetic empathy. And he said it was important for modern art because it helped to enjoy the piece when there wasn't always a narrative, right? Because the modern art was a lot more abstract than the ballet, the earlier ballet, which had a storyline that you'd follow. So the audience needed to empathize physically, kinesthetically, in order to really appreciate this movement. So this notion really did spread from the laboratory into the arts, and it was very much connected with aesthetics in the early part of the 20th century. And the kinesthetic idea of empathy that involved bodies and movement is really crystallized here. This is from Introduction to Psychology textbook, 1939, and it's just captioned empathy, which I think is strange perhaps for us to see. And it's the trainer's leg is raised up as the jumper is going over the pole, right? So it's an imitative movement, right? We might actually move our bodies. We don't necessarily imagine, but we might move our bodies in concert with someone else. And that was sort of defined as empathy. So empathy became this almost very concrete imitative movement. And that's all within, again, the purview of empathy. Again, I don't think today we would title a picture like this empathy, but this kinesthetic anesthetic way of understanding empathy was really key to the early part of the 20th century. What happens kind of mid-century is a shift, and you see social scientists and psychologists trying to take the sort of interpersonal definition, the one that's more familiar today, okay, I'm going to empathize with another person, and they bring that more to the fore. And one of the persons that does this is this woman. Here she's much older, Rosalind Diamond Cartwright, but she was only 24 when she went to Cornell, and she wrote her dissertation on empathy and published it in 1948. And it was one of the first experimental studies of empathy. And she did studies of social psychology students, and they tried to assess how another person would assess their own personality. So would that person say they were friendly, and could you make that prediction? So empathy now is about predicting how other people look at the world, how they see themselves, how they see others. And what happens in her kind of work on empathy in this period is that she talks about it for her studies as an imaginative process, which we see, as I described, in the aesthetic early 20th century interpretation of empathy. But she now uses the term accurate. And I highlighted that in this 1952 study because here empathy is about, can we get into the thinking, feeling, and acting of another But the point is, can we do it accurately? So I think this is key to sort of seeing empathy now as something we can sort of use. How good is it in actually not just saying, oh, I'm feeling, getting a sense of your feeling, but am I getting it right? And this is also the moment when empathy and projection kind of get disentangled. So there's a lot of studies in this post-World War II period that says empathy is not projection. If you're projecting, it's only your feeling, it's not empathy, because empathy is about the other's feeling. So this whole modulation of self and other and the boundaries in empathy, I find very fascinating, and they are shifting across this period. This is an empathy test that gets developed in this period. It kind of just shows that empathy here is kind of cognitive, as we might call it today. It's about predicting other people's likes and dislikes and predicting groups of people. So this one was test would examine whether non-office factory workers preferred polkas or waltzes or Western. Could you figure out what a group of people might like in terms of magazines or music or annoying experiences? So again, a kind of cognitive empathy, as we might call it today. But empathy also emerges in the post-World War II period in the therapeutic context. And one of the big purveyors many of you probably heard of is Carl Rogers, a clinical psychologist who made empathy key to therapeutics, really in the late 40s, again, in the same period. And you can see some of his definitions here. It's this notion of standing in the other's place as if. So this as if is, I think, kind of key to empathy. You never take the other person's position wholly, but you are, you're with them. So there's this kind of interesting connection, but a little bit of distance in empathy. And then the other dimension, the other point I'd like to, emphasize here is, he says he perceives the client's experience and the meaning and the feeling and taste. So it's a multisensorial, it's a multidimensional ability. And so empathy is not, it's about kind of getting a whole sense for the other's experience. And you can use various, feelings and senses and dimensions of your experience to understand that. One thing I do reflect on in my book is why is empathy why does it become so popular after World War II? And this is sort of the Google Ngram that shows you, it's kind of flat. Empathy you can find in psychological dictionaries up until 44. That it's only 1944 that empathy enters like a Webster's dictionary type thing. But then it starts to go up pretty, regularly after about 1947, between 45 and 50. And, some of the reasons for that are just, I think, the horrors of World War II, genocide, the Holocaust. Psychologists and I think the public were asking, why is it that it's so hard for people to get along, right? And why are they so horrible to one another? Psychology is also gaining ground as a field. I think the two are connected. So it's become the popular, at least American culture, is becoming much more interested in what psychologists have to say. And you can kind of see this by one of its early definitions in Reader's Digest. So the word empathy, it's in this whole period, they talk about empathy as a new word. It's kind of a technical word because it comes out of the psychological laboratories. But here you can see it's not that, it's complicated. It's not just an emotional contagion. It's not just feeling what someone else feels. It's about feeling, but having a certain awareness of that feeling, right? So you're emotionally, you're connected, but you have a certain level of judgment, right? It's not just an immersion and experience where you have no awareness or distance or perception of that. So again, I think empathy it's a very complex capacity, and it's understood in many, many different ways. I have just a few other examples of the popularization of empathy, because what I found really interesting in some of these, this is Arthur Godfrey. He was like a big radio personality. And Empathy actually, interestingly, gets picked up by like TV and radio, which is becoming big in the 50s. Radio's earlier, but TV certainly. And a cover like this on Time magazine, which says he has empathy, most people would actually not know what the word meant. And if you go into the article, you would have to read and they would define it. And so in this period, there's so many times the word is misspelled, defined in different ways. People aren't really like keyed into what this term means. Another example I found, which this guy was the head of a Revlon advertising project on Madison Ave. And empathy does almost become a buzzword in this period, funny enough. Like we kind of think maybe it's a buzzword now, but it was that in the 50s too. And the whole idea was to create connections, even consumer connections. So if some people talk about today how empathy can be used to just, kind of in a way just to facilitate consumer connections, right? There have been critiques of empathy lodged on that front. This was already part of the scene of empathy, at least in the 50s, right? How do you cultivate connections between potential, between products and potential consumers? There's also a very interesting development of empathy through what I tracked as the social sciences, educators, social psychologists. And I looked at the work of this Quaker activist, Rachel Davis Dubois. And she was a high school teacher, and then she started developing these assemblies to get people from different cultural backgrounds, races, religions, to share different aspects of their culture. And then she did these empathy conversations. She kind of curated these evenings where she gathered people from all backgrounds in like local YMCAs. And interesting, like Margaret Mead, the famous anthropologist, went to one of them, and psychologists went. They were kind of interested. But she argued that she would curate this with music, and she would encourage people to remember childhood experiences. And what she found is people would talk about their childhoods, there'd be a lot of emotion. And even if they had very different cultural backgrounds, religious practices, there was sharing and community that she built through these connections. So she does some interesting practical work on the ground, as kind of developing, interventions almost to cultivate empathy. And this was a set of radio shows that she did about immigration. Another important figure in kind of this history of empathy is the psychologist Kenneth B. Clarke, who many of you may have heard of. He did the famous doll studies where he and his wife gave children white and black dolls, and the children, both white and black, preferred to play with the white dolls. And he also helped write and organize the social science statement that was appended to the Brown versus Board decision to desegregate schools in 1954. And he collated all that data. So he's kind of a huge figure in the history of psychology. And what I found was he began talking a lot about empathy in the 60s. And he was really talking about interracial empathy. This was an article he wrote called Delusions of the White Liberal. And he basically was asking, white liberals, some of his friends, to, kind of look into their minds and try to find this deeper sense of empathy that he called raceless. And he gave many talks over the course of his life about the importance of empathy. So I'm going to this is the last bit on mirror neurons that, again, I think is important just to touch upon, because in the late 90s and 2000s, this became a popularized neuroscientific vision of empathy, where, now we have the hardwired basis for empathy. And it got a huge amount of press. And so a lot of people began to think of empathy in neuroscientific terms. The situation is a lot more complicated. Neuroscientists are trying to, pin down various types of empathy. And now it's divided into different, either cognitive, emotional, or action empathy. And just to conclude this very wide-ranging kind of history, what I draw from the history is, and the ways I see empathy used today, is this idea that empathy should be defined in this capacious way. I think there are some psychologists today that try to focus on emotional empathy. But when I look at sort of this historical range, empathy has a lot of potential and has been seen in these very many dimensions. So I kind of tend toward looking at it now as a multifaceted ability that is not only emotional, but has this level of awareness, thoughts, imaginations, even embodied responses. And and it can be used to grasp the experience of others, which may also include, as I said, art objects, nature, animals, non-human entities, which, the original definition of empathy was also designed to reach. So I think I'm probably out of time, but that's a kind of quick rundown. And I thanks very much for the opportunity to sort of review this. It was fun.
Well, Dr. Lanzoni, thank you very much for the opportunity to hear your perspective. And just a quick reminder for everybody in the audience, Dr. Lanzoni's book is one of the many resources in the bookshelf, and I pasted the link to that in the chat box. I'm glad you can empathy as a multifaceted approach. A number of colleagues in the chat box asked variations on a theme, which is, how do we know if and when we're getting empathy right or doing it accurately? What does that even look like if it's so?
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question, and I sort of go back to Carl Rogers, because he was cultivating a therapeutic empathy that, interesting. He's a trained psychologist, but as he kept working with empathy, he saw it going way beyond the clinical realm. It was something that it was, he wrote an article called An Empathic Way of Being. He thought it could be used in all different situations. And as he defined it, it was, you had to have the other person say, yes, indeed, I feel empathized with, right? So I think that was one of the ways that you got it right, at least in that therapeutic context. You can go back to some of the studies that I mentioned in the 50s where, can you predict what someone's going to say about themselves on a personality test? Well, that you can actually, say, yeah, you're a good predictor or you're not a good predictor. So those are ways that experimenters can kind of test for it. In the more fluid one-on-one realm, you're with someone and you're empathizing with their experience and they look at you kind of blankly. You may not have gotten it right, or you may have totally missed the mark, unless they say, that they might have that sense or feeling of being empathized with. So that could be
a terrific segue into another comment from my friend and colleague, Micah Parson at the Museum of Us, formerly the San Diego Museum of Man. So glad to have you here with us, Micah, who suggests that the golden rule versus the platinum rule is treat others how they want to be treated, which then led into some questions. Well, how do we know how people want to be treated? How do we not get it wrong? And sometimes that might include language or cultural barriers. And somebody referenced that music and performing arts, as you were referencing earlier, can be great equalizers in this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting idea. How would someone, what would someone else need and want? And it's not necessarily what I would want, meaning to empathize, as you're saying, that platinum rule. I don't know if there's a guide exactly that will tell you. I mean, I know for Kenneth Clarke, for interracial empathy, he really thought white people had to kind of break down these barriers. And I think that was a certain amount of looking inward and seeing, okay, what are my assumptions? What is my history? Learning a little bit about other cultures and Black experience. And so I think that might be part of the bigger task of empathy. It may not always just be automatic if you're, with someone who's a very different background. And so those things have to, should be taken into account. I do also think that there may be, so for instance, with Rachel Davis Du Bois and her work, there may be moments too of empathy where music or singing a song together might connect you to someone. But then how do you sort of sustain that over time? That might mean more energy and work into sort of understanding. So that's why I also think that there is a kind of cognitive aspect to empathy. It's not just, oh, you're feeling sad, I can feel sad with you. I can use my kind of rational ability, my ability to understand, to inform me maybe more about why you're feeling sad, especially maybe you're experiencing racism. Maybe then I have a little more information or a little more insight, maybe is a better word, to bring to the situation.
Well, in closing, I know we've got just a moment left, but as a professor in a university, talking with museum students every day, I appreciate the cognitive aspect of it. So I appreciate how you presented the topic of empathy in a historical perspective, which I think is going to be great. I will certainly use it next semester in my activism and social issues class. So thank you for that. And then I'm reflecting more broadly on the work that many of us do in the museum field as we understand the reasons or the motivations for visitors, what brings them to our institutions. And sometimes they're coming for a cognitive experience or a social experience or an affective experience. Mm-hmm. And it seems what you've described here about empathy is intertwined, a multidimensional approach in all of those areas. Right. So thank you so much for your expertise and your time today. Elif, I'll turn it back over to you now.
Thank you so much, Susan. This was very insightful, and we certainly learned a lot. Much appreciated. And I guess with that, we are concluding the morning session of our gathering, of our summit, day one. And we have half an hour break. And then at 12:30, I'm sorry, it's 12:30 now. Sorry, I just got mixed up. At 1 o'clock, we have a brown bag lunch presentation. I called it brown bag because I was just notified about this the possibility of this presentation, which I didn't want to miss. I think it is very important for all of us to see, how empathy is incorporated into developing technology, which is all about our future. So please be back at 1 o'clock. As mentioned earlier, the same link that you have used to join us this morning will be valid throughout the day. Thank you again to all our presenters and performers, Amelia, Venerable Priyadarshi, and Susan Lanzoni, and our event team, Lori, Laurel, and Greg, for keeping this moving. See you at 1 o'clock.
Hi, Elif.
Hi, Nancy. How are you?
Good. How are you? It's been fascinating. Absolutely. And thank you for this.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. And I love your color, which I'm sure is symbolic.
I was going to say, I love it too, and probably for all the same reasons.
South African. Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Beautiful.
It made after apartheid went down. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a friend here from South Africa. I don't know if she's on now, but
Great. Fabulous. Oh,
see you back.
hello.
I'm having a bowl of dessert cereal.
Wonderful. Enjoy. So is Camilo here?
Hello, Elif. I'm
Hi,
here.
Camilo. How are you?
Doing well. How about you?
I'm fine, thank you. Am I pronouncing your name correct?
It's correct. Camilo.
Camilo Rojas?
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. Maybe let's give, I don't know how we are doing in terms of participation. Maybe just give 1 more minute. People are coming in.
Sorry, Laurel. Could you remind me which is the window that I'm supposed to pin?
You'll want to pin Lori. She's wearing a kind of reddish orange shirt if you're scanning for her.
I saw her.
Yeah, I'm waving at you now. I'm in red.
I can. You have been pinned.
Okay. Maybe 1 more minute.
No problem.
Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. Please continue to enjoy your snacks or lunch, depending on your time zone. So thank you for coming back. And last year, we were, a couple of us were at the MIT Media Lab for an empathy building workshop at the invitation of Venerable Priyadarshi. And that's when I met Camilo, and he is with the Fluid Interfaces Research Group at the MIT Media Lab. And he will now share with us his project called Project Us. So Camilo, please take the floor.
Thank you so much, Elif. I am sharing my screen now. Let's see. Can you all see my slide?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, wonderful. Well, Elif, thank you so much for the invitation to be here with all of you. It's truly a pleasure. And I'm extremely happy to see how fast this community has grown since I met you at the Media Lab. And I'm happy to share the research that we have been doing during the last almost year and a half at the Fluid Interfaces group. When I joined the Media Lab, I was extremely interested on exploring the intersection between empathy and technology. So more precisely, how can we use the incredible technological advances to help foster empathy? And a domain that was particularly interesting to me is affective computing, which it was also born at the Media Lab. And it basically is a set of techniques that enable computers to derive cues about the emotions of people. And I was particularly interested on using these computers not as the end consumer, but more as a Google Translate for emotions, something that could help people to communicate better. So we started exploring this principle that we developed called humans in the loop. So this is just a show of the idea that we had in mind when we first began the project. Let's say that we have a conversation between two coworkers. They are building our devices that are embedded in a set of jewels for her and in a necklace for him. These devices are able to monitor multiple biosignals, acoustics, and other expressions of our communication. And at a certain point of the conversation, they are able to infer that she is angry. So we would be able to communicate this message to his jewels and deliver a nudge about that emotional cue. For example, a subtle vibration. And the idea is that this will enable him to corroborate the feedback from the device with the observations that he's doing. For example, the facial expression, the gestures on the hands, the tone of voice, and learn that, well, those are her angry eyes. And the way we devise it right now, I'm showing only one direction of the information flow. The idea is to make it bi-directional. So the same process would work for her. And that's why we call it humans in the loop. We actually inserting in an information, we embed them in an information loop about their emotions. And let's see if I can change the slide. There you go. So after quite a bit of work, we developed two prototypes. And we are using machine learning to analyze multiple signals from the interlocutors, for example, tone of voice, physio signals. We are working also on visual cues like facial expressions. And we put that together and we provide them informational cues about the emotional content that they are conveying in real time. So the first device that we tested was the wearable. That's the image on the left. So we started monitoring the electrodermal activity. That is basically the electrical activity of your sweat glands. So it's been studied for quite a long while that the sweat glands, they often change the electrical properties when a person undergoes a moment of strong emotional arousal. So in the device, we catch that signal, we process it, we communicate it wirelessly to an identical device. This is a wristband, by the way, and we deliver a subtle vibration to the other person. So I'm going to talk a little bit more ahead about the experiments that we did with this system. But I want to share that also we started working on a web interface that uses audio as the input. And we are working on picking up the emotional biomarkers that are usually hidden in the voice and that could give additional information that is perhaps not evident about the emotional reaction that a certain person is experiencing. And we deliver visual feedback to the conversation partner in real time. So in this case, it's a website. So it doesn't matter if you're using Zoom, Skype, or Microsoft Teams. You can just open the website and begin using it. Now, this is a small video to illustrate the operation of the system.
You missed the deadline.
I did my best.
I'm sorry for my reaction. I understand that it was a difficult job, and I think there might be a way to work it out.
There you go. So now, sorry. A little bit about the user studies. We began testing it with 18 romantic partners that came to the Media Lab to have face-to-face conversations. We gave them the bracelets. They were in a closed, intimate space. We asked them if they could write down 3 subjects that were the source of a discussion during the last 3 weeks. And then, well, we actually selected the ones that did not match because those were the ones that were still open. And we asked them to have two conversations, one per topic. We delivered the feedback in one of the conversations. We did not deliver feedback in the other conversations. And then we studied how the feedback changed the course of the conversation. So that was published. And if you go to if you Google Project Us MIT Media Lab, you'll find our website. I also added to the bookshelf, and I just, I will post it in the Zoom chat as well. So we published the results. They were really interesting. I'm going to discuss them very soon, but I wanted to share a little bit about what happened afterwards. We started testing the web interface. That happened during the last weeks, and we did a user study with 20 participants. We also submitted for a publication, which is actually in press. So hopefully in November, you will be able to find it in our website as well. And now we are scaling up. We are beginning a new user study with 100 participants, and we are very interested in studying potential learning effects. Like what happens if a person uses our system multiple times through a longitudinal study, and then we remove the feedback. Whether we want to learn whether continuous use will change the baseline and improve empathetic behaviors, and whether that change will persist once they no longer have the system, which is hopefully what we aim to deliver. Now, the results that we have been seeing consistently on the experiments is that the users experience an increased level of attention and awareness of themselves and the others. So we measured the effect of the device, or we studied the effect of the device through two types of techniques. The first ones are qualitative. We make a semi-structured interview. Well, we deliver several instruments, but we also make a semi-structured interview, trying to understand what was the effect of the device, what actions did they take when they felt the feedback, what's their interpretation of how the device works, and so on. And some of the thoughts that the subjects shared was that they see in the device a sort of emotional check-in reminder, and that it not only triggers reflection on them, but it also triggers action, in the sense that they take concrete actions such as making a pause, rephrasing what they are about to say. And what is very interesting is that we also applied quantitative metrics to try to understand the effect of the device in the conversation. And for this, we use natural language processing techniques. So what we do is that we take the transcript of the conversation, and we study, for example, the number of how the feedback is changing the number of perceptual words that the users are using in the conversation. And perceptual words are the ones that are associated, for example, with feel, see, hear. We have also seen that it increases the number of questions. We have also seen that it increases the use of the we pronoun, and it decreases the use of the I pronoun. And finally, that it increases the number of social words that they use. For example, friend, brother, wife. And there is more and more literature that is starting to use these patterns as cues or as indicators of empathetic behaviors. Going forward, something really interesting that we want to start trying, that we want to start studying as well, is to see the patterns in real time. Like what happens after we, what is the reaction that the partners are typically having after we deliver feedback to a certain user. We have the suspicion that we will be able to see synchrony phenomena. Yeah, that's one of the interesting directions going forward. Now, some of the applications that we have seen for the system is on supporting mental health efforts, particularly now with COVID. It seems that we'll be restrained to the Zoom interface for a while. And we would love to explore if these additional layers of information can help people to communicate, can help people to suffer less from Zoom fatigue, or whether they will help them to manage better conflicted conversations at work, or take them to a better outcome. We are also interested on partnering with psychologists for integrating our system for couples therapy. We also see a lot of potential on helping doctors to train their communication style to improve their rapport with the patient. There has been studies already, particularly in empathetic communication for doctors, that have shown that empathy-enhancing interventions can help them to obtain more critical information from the patient, which results in higher patient satisfaction and more accurate diagnostics. We will also love to explore the domain of team productivity. How can we use these tools to help teams to communicate better? And also for making more accessible leadership training within companies. This is a space that right now it's very much focused on the top executives, and I think that organizations could help. It could benefit a lot if we could make it more accessible to other collaborators. Now, if you're interested in our work, please do visit our website. We have videos, papers, resources, and also we have a link to try the demo online that we are rolling out. So feel free to register also if you would like to participate in our user studies or experiments in the future. We also have a form to enroll people interested over there. One interesting dimension that we have been exploring also is transforming our project in an art installation. So here is a representation of how it looked like. The partners or museum goers would engage in a conversation, and we would deliver, say, a visual, an aesthetic and visual representation that is derived from their emotional, from our processing of their emotional signals. And we see it as a great opportunity not only to share the outcomes of our research with the general public, but also to obtain feedback from the museum goers. And this is a precious guide to understand better how to go forward with our research. Now, I'd like to give a big thank to everyone collaborating in this project. Here are some of the colleagues that are making this big effort happening. And of course, the PI from Fluid Interfaces, Patty Mize. And please don't hesitate to get in contact. And our vision is to use technology to support better conversations and relationships through empathy building. So that's everything on my side, and I'll be happy to address any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Camilo. And Greg, if I may, I would like to jump in with the first question. So I have a question. I mean, this is very interesting, your project, and just helps me individually, you know, to see empathy from a completely different perspective, broken into all its parts, and, you know, sort of almost like trying to replicate what we naturally can do, but, you know, with the help of this device, amplify or bring it to those who empathy does not come naturally, perhaps, or can improve it. You mentioned that one of your goals is to bring this to museums or the companies, right? I mean, because this empathy as a leadership skill is very hot topic right now. I was just wondering, you know, like how I have this idea of positioning empathy as a shared value field, where, companies, corporations, museums, academic institutions can invest in this, developing these projects collectively, so that as museums are learning perhaps to how to make their programs more accessible and their programs more relevant to their communities, then corporations could benefit from the very same project in an entirely different way, because empathy permeates all aspects of our lives, and we need solutions also to address all those things. Do you have a sense of like how the sustainability of a project like this would move forward? I mean, would a company perhaps be interested enough to just oh, we really need this as a product because we are struggling with empathy training for our leadership. We think that this could be of help. How would that look like? Or I mean, do you even, like, as an engineer perhaps, is this in your focus area, or would someone else then pick up the ball and run with it? Just curious about the structure. How to scale this?
Thank you so much, Elif. That's honestly a great idea that, to be completely honest, we hadn't considered. We always, or so far, saw as the two main, let's say, the two main directions forward as museums and companies, but we saw them as individual pursuits or separate pursuits. It will be super interesting to explore something together. I was actually having a conversation yesterday with my wife. She's a management consultant, and it's about how COVID completely changed this landscape, in the sense that companies are now more than ever interested in investing in the well-being of their employees. They have been substantially, for example, increasing the subscriptions to Headspace and to other technological resources for helping their mental wellness. So I think there's definitely fertile ground for corporations to invest in this inward. I also think that there is fertile ground for them to extend it as it just makes sense to extend it beyond the company, because at the end of the day, the employees are not if they want to build skills in their employees, they will not be restrained to what they do in the office or during office hours. It will extend to the rest of the day, and then it makes, I mean, I guess it will take a little bit of thought. Will be like the exact modality on how a company collaborates, for example, with the community in itself. But I think that a collaboration with a museum, it's an excellent entry point.
So it's a call out to all our museum folks here. If you're interested in, please, get in touch with Camilo, and perhaps this can be the start of some, interesting partnership. And Greg,
absolutely.
Back to you.
No, you are a terrific segue. I was thinking, as Camila, as you were talking, how would this play out in a museum environment? And then, of course, your slide on how this might be a very engaging exhibition component, which then got me thinking about, for example, Micah Parzan, I think you might be on with us right now, and how the race exhibit, the Race Are We So Different exhibit, really transformed your institution, and how something like this, where you're able to get people to share their emotions and express them in different ways so that we better understand each other, might be a great something for your museum and others, of course. I'm also looking at several very good comments in here. Louise asks, actually a question, Louise asks, Camilo, how do you address the issue of the individual and how their own situation affects their ability to be empathetic? For example, fear reduces empathy, anxiety impacts perception. Is there a baseline of individual to assess their own aptitude, or is that the wrong way to look at it?
Thank you so much for the question. I don't think that at this point there is a wrong way to look at it. Like when we began with the project, we had such a big exploration space that I think that there are just many angles to look at it. Now, when you mention the baseline of the individual, so far we take some baseline questions, but I think our experimentation has been more focused on what is the minimum amount of information that we can deliver so that people find this useful. That's why we talk about providing them with a nudge every once in a while, because we would like to say trigger their own empathetic skills or their own skills for doing reflection and taking action when they sense the feedback. So we don't tell them like, so your partner did X, so we suggest that you should do Y and Z. That's not where we are heading right now, and that's in our first steps the way that we are hoping to account for individuality. Just resort on the innate resources that each person has. But that is something that we would love to study now with the virtual interface, because it's difficult often to do these experiments with the wearable, in the sense that you have to take the person to the same place, and you have to there are more logistics. With the web interface is something where we can easily engage 100 or 1,000 people, and then see how the individual variations change with respect of a mean. For example, how can we better adapt the system to the individual? Yeah.
Well, as you're talking, there are a couple of our colleagues in the audience, for example, in Palestine and the Children's Museum in Pittsburgh, all saying, yes, let's do this. We could volunteer to engage in this. Are there any privacy concerns as you're doing this research?
So yeah, thank you so much, Jim, for raising this. Absolutely. That how should I start with this? There are many different concerns that we can discuss. I mean, that they span from privacy, data security, agency, also the technological authority. Those are many of the questions that we are tackling. In terms of privacy, that is a core principle that we work with in fluid interfaces. That it's something that we always seek to protect the best that we can. So far, we have been playing it as safe as we can. That's also why we started with romantic partners. Because it was an intimate space where there was mutual consent, and where they were effectively working on doing something for themselves. That's also something that with the web interface, right now, when you use it, it's going to require the consent of the person with whom you are speaking. Otherwise, you will get the feedback about yourself, which is still valuable, but yeah, if you want to engage with someone else, you will have to have a bit of a conversation beforehand. And I can only say that we will elaborate a lot more on that in our upcoming publications, and there is already some of the there is already our initial thoughts and discussions in the publications so far.
Well, this is very fascinating. Thank you. And personally, when you brought up the slide about emotional check-in reminder and training ourselves to listen more, I was thinking there's many times when I could use an emotional check-in myself. So thank you for that very personal reminder as well. Elif, back to you.
Thank you. No, this was fascinating, Camilo. Thank you so much. And one of the things that, I often think that, I mean, we feel empathy and we normally do not really think about it, do not really think much about what took place, what happened. But this kind of intervention really, I think, helps us to stop and think and just contemplate for a minute or a second that something really happened to me. It's an experience. It is extremely important to learn empathy through experiences, and this really sort of augments the experience for a human being, basically, that we can just, like this just happened to me. Just maybe it brings the state of presence that Venerable Priyadarshi was talking about, right? We are in the presence, we notice what is taking place, which is as equally important as empathy taking place on its own. Us realizing is equally important. I think that's what I'm trying to say. And thank you very much for this introduction. And I see that there are many people who are willing to get in touch with you. So hopefully this will be a start of a good, partnership. And please also keep in mind my idea of, empathy as a shared value field, that I would, if this, something happens here, just please do let me know and see if we can, start a case study on this, like how this is evolving and whether it's working. Because we have a lot to learn on this journey. So thank you again, Camila. Thank you. And with that, I think it is time for our panel discussion. And I don't know if we have any tips for our viewers that maybe they can put everybody side by side or choose whichever view is best for you. But we have a wonderful panel. Inviting back again Venerable Tenzin Priyadarshi, President and Chief Executive Officer of Dalai Lama Center for Ethics and Transformative Values, and also the author of Running Towards Mystery. And then Amir Baradaran, CEO and founder, ABXR Studio, Ibegu, another AI in art, and guest lecturer at Columbia University. Makiba Clay, Chief Diversity Officer at the Phillips Collection, and Amelia Winger-Bearskin, artist, technologist, and our first performer this morning. And thank you again for coming together.
Hi, thank you so much for having us. It's a pleasure to be here.
I only see Venerable Priyadarshi and Amelia and myself right now. Oh, and Amir is here. Okay, yes. And we're waiting for Makiba.
I'm actually here. I'm actually on my screen. I'm right next to you.
Oh, really? Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
It's just, okay, now I see you. All right. Let me just do a quick magic here. And also, maybe it's just because of the size of my screen. Oh.
Good to see you again, Makiba. It's good to see you, Amir and Tenzin.
Yeah, so this is the group, the Venerable Priyadarshi, Amir, Amelia, and Makiba. We were all at the summit with His Holiness in 2018. And this is also our chance to get together again, because this is also one of our commitments to come back every year for a collective learning experience. So I'm so grateful for everyone to come back, and also for your presence, Venerable Priyadarshi. And so we discussed, this morning, we talked about the definitions of empathy and whether, and how it can be positioned within the context of oneness or our interdependence. And then Susan mentioned about the capaciousness of the definition of empathy, the fact that there's still room, that we are sort of learning and evolving, and all these discussions help. And then we talked, Venerable Priyadarshi mentioned that it is important to bring the presence of this compassionate presence wherever we go. And Camilo's presentation was one of those efforts, right, to on this journey to help us with our understanding of empathy, so that eventually we will be able to bring it with us wherever we go, and we recognize that this is our land, wherever we may end up, and then act compassionately to everyone around us. And technology is a big part of this, our future, right? I mean, our future is now. And please also keep in mind that the audience here, including myself, are not a technologist. I can hardly monitor my iPhone. So in your explanations, I would appreciate it if you could use, non-technological words so that I could understand at least and so respond. I would appreciate that. But with that, I would like to explore this idea of empathy. And the title of our gathering is Designing Compassionate AR, VR, AI through Empathy. But on a second thought, I thought what I really wanted to discuss here is how do we design innovative products that speak the language of empathy and compassion? With that, I would like to first inquire with Makiba as a leader, the values that she thinks that are important in our world. And then I would like to ask Amelia and Amir from the technologist's perspective, what are some of the issues in terms of the language of these technologies and the processes that we currently have in place? And then I would like to go back to Venerable Priyadarshi with my final question and his insights. So with that, I would like to approach the Makiba. Makiba, thank you so much for being here. And
thank you, my sister Elif, and all of my brothers and sisters who are here today. I am, this is such a critical moment for all of us. And we've been thinking a lot about what we've lost in the midst of COVID-19 and the environmental crisis, election coming up, systemic racism, all of these disasters, frankly. And we've talked a lot about the grief and loss as a result of that. And I've been focusing my moments of gratitude every morning for the last several months around what is the gift in this? What are we able to capture from this moment individually and collectively? And one of the things that I think has been happening is that we're all now taking inventory of what really matters. When you talk about values, Elif, in fact, the last 3 months I've been working on this journey, what we're calling an organizational culture journey at the Phillips, which for some of you who may know the Phillips collection, our work is embedded in values around empathy and well-being, and how using the arts can be a catalyst for shaping, creating, reinforcing both empathy and well-being based on the story, our founder's story, which interestingly enough, our museum was born out of a pandemic. Can you believe that? After the Spanish influenza, this is how Duncan Phillips lost 2 members of his family, his brother and his father, in quick succession. And so all of what we do is about these ideas of empathy and well-being. But in taking the inventory and reassessing, what does this really mean? What does it look like? How does it show up? We cannot embody that which we don't understand or that we haven't fully embraced, not just from an institutional level. So we've taken time to step back, and I've really appreciated the time that we've been able to grow our communication, grow our capacity as leaders in the digital space, to have colleagues on a screen just like this, really lifting the veil. It's not about checklists and yeah, we'll get to the exhibitions, but how are you and you and you and you in the midst of all of these calamities? How are you showing up at work? I know you lost your father. You lost your son. You're scrambling around just like I am, trying to teach an 8-year-old on all these virtual platforms that I don't quite understand. How are you able to show up and do the work that we're being paid to do at a reduction? You know, these are the kind of conversations we've been having internally. Someone spoke about, you know, starting with the employee side in the workforce. And yes, we'll get to our audiences because that's frankly how we, you know, get paid and how our work gets sustained from our audiences. But we've spent a lot of time in these last couple of months saying, who are we in the midst of where we are situated right now? Technology has enabled us to reach time a more diverse audience in terms of age in terms of racial demographics, my goodness, this was on our agenda for 2 years out. How do we get into the digital space, and how do we, that happened in rapid speed because of the time and the moment that we're in. I've been really inspired by the fact that to see the multi-generational connection points, both online internally as well as externally, all because of things that were out of our control. And seeing how in the museum space, we've been able to gain some level of, one, we've had to be agile and pivot and get into a space that we didn't necessarily have the infrastructure for, but we collectively came together. A lot of our millennials, shout out to them, because they helped us figure out what we don't know in this space. We're like, what? We're like you, Elif, trying to figure out our iPhones. But we've been able to use that at these levers of institutional insight and folks who we didn't even know had digital capacities to help us create a community. My work around diversity, equity, access, and inclusion is all about belonging. Who would have ever thought that you'd have folks on screen, whether it be audience in programs, staff, tearing up, saying, I feel seen. I matter. What's happening to me matters. My experiences matter. And that's what I call the embodiment, taking empathy, words like inclusion off of a checklist and showing up in practice, meeting people where they are, our work, but this itself is the work of making people feel like they matter and that they belong. I think I may have exceeded my time, and I can come back in after others, Elif, but I just wanted to start with that framework of where I'm at as a leader and the kind of conversations that I've been pushing internally and with others who I'm working with.
Makiba, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and experiences from the last, few months. And as you said, we never thought that we would be in this place, and we don't have the right infrastructures often, yet we are, right? We just jumped in and we have to sort of find our way. That's actually a very effective way of empathy building. It is one of what I call the ingredients of alchemy of empathy, vulnerability, which unites us. Now we have experienced a collective vulnerability. That's our common denominator. But even within this case, the very technologies that we use, they are designed by those people who might have other worldviews, right? Or they might not be exposed to what the topics that we are talking about. So I would like to ask Amir about the language of these technologies. Whose language, values, and ethics are being used to develop these very powerful technologies? And what are some of the ways arts and museums can be a platform to improve this language?
All right. Hello, everyone. Such a pleasure to see so many wonderful faces 2 years after as well. Yeah, I'll jump into it very quickly. I think as part of my research, which is basically arts-based creative research, that's what I do, which tries to understand technological problems through the very act of making art. And through that process, what has been quite interesting for me is to understand that technology itself is not, as the modernist perception of it may want to make us believe, is not an objective element. There's a fallacy of objectivity that needs to be taken to task. And once you take that to task, then you understand all the different ways in which it can impact our lives. So if lines of codes are not objective by themselves, that means I use a terminology. I call my engineers my poets. my coders, my poets. I write it as PO capital A capital I for artificial intelligence, TS, because the same way a poet pours herself or himself into and theirself into the lines of text that they produce that then connects us when we read it or when we consume it. The same way a writer who's a coder basically pours their value system in the kind of codes that are being written. So in that sense, once we acknowledge that, then we acknowledge that all codes are biased because by nature they are biased, because they're written by humans. So this is really the first component of that. And I just want to jump into one kind of really interesting point, which I think is necessary to discuss, is that when we talk about artificial intelligence, which is something I work with, often we talk about the narrow AI, right? So it's like very specific kind of, it's the vision, or it's like a particular movement or what you have. But there's also another major component to AI, which is the artificial general intelligence. And that's, it has had its winters and ups and downs, but nonetheless, it has been one of the ways in which it has framed that overall AI industry altogether. And if you look at the artificial general intelligence, what's really interesting is that it comes up with all kinds of human-like processes and qualities, such as consciousness, creativity. And for me, it becomes then interesting, because then it's like, so what does it mean to be a human? So these are important questions that come. But more importantly, the question becomes, do we have the right ontologies to understand the advent of AI outside of an anthropocentric understanding of intelligence and being and the process of becoming? And in that sense, what can be very counterintuitive, but quite, for me, pleasant and generative, is to say, can we use often marginalized cosmologies that have come to be marginalized through a process of colonization to better understand our own relationship to the self and to the other as we understand the role of AI in our lives? And in that sense, I think, decolonization becomes a major component of that process, to understand power dynamics that are behind it, historicizing the technology itself, where it comes from, what kind of ideas does it mobilize as it presents itself as a progress, right? And more importantly, as it comes in relation to artificial intelligence, is what's that relationship between us and the other? And how do we define that?
And Amir, I think this could be a topic for the entire the separate panel. But I would like to point out to our audience here, Amir, along with a colleague, co-author, wrote a chapter for Designing for Empathy book, in which he talks about this issue of the other. How do we? So the question I posed to him was, how do we perceive the other? How do we define the other? Who is this other we are trying to empathize with? And it depends to, in our cultural context, to me, it could be, my Greek friends, for example, and for Greeks, it could be Turkish friends, like it could be as nationalistic as that. But in the case of AI, then what is it? We have so many other identities. And in his chapter, if I'm not remembering it incorrectly, I think more than 20 different identities come up for one individual person as we go into the land of avatars and AR and VR, and with our each potential encounters with the other as a as a human, as a animal, as a inanimate object, and and depending on which platform you are, your identity just goes through the roof. So that's why it is very important that that engineers should be poets, and they should code their lines with, love and compassion, and bring the values to that type of land, right? Artificial intelligence and the virtual land is a different kind of land that we need to be present again. And with that, I would like to ask Amelia, so what are some of the ways, these values of empathy, compassion, justice, and equity can be incorporated into the innovation process or the product design process? Are there like checklists that, anybody who is developing a software, let's say, they go, oh, like equity check or compassion check. Is it like that, or where are we at currently?
Well, when you are starting a coding project, very frequently one of the first things you do is you make sure all of the things that your software project depends on, and we call those dependencies. Some of those dependencies could be what kind of computer you have to run it, what it expects from an internet connection. It could be other types of libraries, other code that you're building on. We have this phrase that all code should be building on the shoulder of giants, so that each person is assumed not to be creating everything from scratch, but building upon the innovation of the community and those other great minds that have come before you. So what I've thought about through my project Wampum.Codes is being inspired by indigenous values of co-creation and how we can actually encode ethics into our code. What if we had value-based dependencies and ethic-based dependencies, so that when you try to run a program, if you were not in consensus, if you had not articulated clearly those values and actually put them into your package.json or put them into the source code or put them into your hardware chip, so that you and your team, both your technical and non-technical people, articulated clearly your values, what you want this code to mean, what is it for, what kind of change are you hoping to accomplish in the world? In 7 generations in the future, how would you imagine that this would have made impact? What is the core value of what you're creating? Not just for this generation, not for this just group of people, but to really just start having a long view of your software project. And then I created a simple protocol so that all coders can create these Wampum.Codes dependencies within their projects. And so oftentimes there's a gulf between ethicists and philosophers and coders, obviously not in Amir's team, but in other teams there's a gulf, and people feel as though they maybe don't have permission to make those things clear. If I'm a product designer or a graphic designer, do I feel empowered to make clear the ethics that I want to embed within this software project? Yes, every person who's involved in the decision-making process, in the design process, should be able to raise their voice and to reach a consensus around what the ethics and values are. And we can actually encode those into our code base, and we can share those with others. We can have accountability links. We can hold each other accountable. We could create complex systems if we wanted. It could be on a blockchain. It could be something that's cryptically secure in order to verify this with our community. You could have something that an API key is pulled down and removed so that no one could use this incorrectly. But I don't like to think about enforcement in the beginning, because first we have to have the compassionate imagination with which to articulate our values, to have these conversations. And then at that point, the community should decide how it wants to keep itself accountable and how it wants its community members to also hold itself accountable as well. And I think a lot about the ways in which colonial mindset and colonization extracts ideas that we like, that flatter our own opinions, and very, very frequently it leaves out those dependencies of values and ethics that actually made that thing possible in the first place. For instance, in my own culture, the Haudenosaunee or Six Nation Iroquois, we had a great law of peace that was the basis of the US Constitution. However, when Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and George Washington, used our basis of our lasting peace and prosperity, they took out a lot of the key dependencies that we had. For instance, women are the only ones who can vote in our tribe. Very different than the way the US Constitution was created. Also, we do not have something like slavery-dependent agriculture. Our agriculture is sustainable and in harmony with the environment. And we think of ourselves as being deeply in communion and conversation with human and non-human animals. And in fact, we don't have a different way of describing human and non-human beings. So whether you're two-legged or four-legged, you are in communion and you are kin. So I like to think about that we mustn't colonize our future. We shouldn't extract only the values that we see that flatter our own opinions, but really make sure that we're in harmony and in congress with all of our kin. Thank you.
That was beautiful, Amelia. I completely agree with everything that you said, and so many new ideas and potential that we, as a group, I think we should investigate further. Definitely. So one good thing is that these conversations are recorded, so we will be able to refer back. And obviously, 5 minutes is not enough for each one of you. It's not, I mean, this could be like an entire summit of its own, each of these conversations. So thank you so much for being here and sharing a little bit of your insight with us. And with that, I would like to go back to Venerable Priyadarshi. And so I have this question. It looks like these subjects of incorporating these values, or even like deciding which values and then incorporating them into the languages and the processes of these innovation that we are seeing that's happening so rapidly. And last year, when we were actually in 2018, when we gathered in Dharamsala, a very sad event that happened, that the synagogue shooting, I think it was in Pittsburgh, I think. And that was the night of our gathering. It was today, and we lit a candle that night, and so that light might overcome darkness. Last year, around this time, the main events, one of the technological events, were Elon Musk sending his big red car to the outer space with an astronaut in it. At the same time, there were shootings and police brutality was going on the ground on our Earth. And right now, again, like we have, God knows what advance just happened as we were in this conversation, yet we are trying to solve very human problems, right? Our own problems that begin with each one of us. So this seems to me a dilemma. How do we break this this cycle of like chicken and egg? Like, do we first do this, and it looks like everything has to happen simultaneously? But what is the way forward to for us to be able to continue on this path?
Question is of the same magnitude as what is the meaning of life?
And you have 2 minutes to answer, please.
0. I think one of the things of being human is to gain an appreciation for paradoxes. That sometimes reality may seem quite paradoxical, but it's always an issue of how not to ignore the immediacy or urgency of things that are on ground while we continue to explore what is beyond, what is in the space, and so on. And this is why it's important to recognize the role of the individual. If we as humans are not able to regulate, modify, eliminate certain kinds of biases, certain kinds of mental and behavioral dispositions, it doesn't matter what planet we are on. It doesn't matter what civic society we create. Those dispositions are still going to hinder us. We'll simply introduce that sense of a barbaric mindset in some ways, unless and until we begin to start to curb it and start to look at, am I actually manifesting the virtues and the qualities that I truly wish to see being manifested in this world? The second thing I want to be cautious about, and is we as a culture, we as a society have become very prominent in virtue signaling. You see, before we used to blame Wall Street for that, and now there's Silicon Valley for that. But this virtue signaling is coming from all aspects of the world, all aspects of different kinds of institutions, where rather than truly engaging and building a culture, we like to tell narratives about it. You see, narratives are important. Storytelling is an important aspect, but there should be substance to that story. There should be content to that story. So we have to be careful that we don't simply engage in the art form of empathy and compassion building in the name of building organizational culture just as a PR gimmick. And even academic institutions can be blamed for that, let alone Wall Street and Silicon Valley and so on. So those are things that I think we need to sort of be careful about. And you have to understand when we are developing these aspects of, machine learning and AI platforms, it's still quite primitive. It's still quite primitive in the sense that you have to understand that we don't even fully appreciate or understand how humans learn value, how humans learn moral decision making. So many of our approaches, including many of my colleagues, and I say it with utmost respect for their work, but it's a very reductionist approach to understanding how humans make moral decisions or how humans make compassionate relationships. And reductionism at certain stages is helpful for the purpose of designing study, because you can't just design a humongous study with too many variables in it. But we have to recognize that it is not one all and be all in this thing. Just because we are able to derive a certain data sets that supports my study does not imply that it is valid in all domains of reality, you see. And this is something that as engineers, as scientists, we have to be very cautious and very careful of as we sort of do a deep dive into this thing. Oftentimes, running a Center for Ethics at MIT, I have had many opportunities where some of my colleagues have said, Venerable Tenzin, just give us a kind of data set that we can program and we'll just, make everything ethical. And this is the thing. You have to understand the distinction between ethics and compliance. Ethics is not compliance. See, you have to understand the framing that what may be legal is not ethical. There are many aspects of our legal systems that checks all the boxes and says this is legal, this is legal. But from a human standpoint, when I look at it, there's a sense of discomfort that arises, and we recognize that it is not ethical. Discrimination of sorts. They were legal at certain points in human history, but they are not ethical, and so on. So this exploration for as an individual is important. And I'm not undermining the power of system, you see, but it's very important, you see, this thing. In the last few years, as I have been sort of going around running kind of a variety of sessions and teachings and so on, people are very quick to say, but it's the system. But the system is like that. And oftentimes these are the 1% that are studying in the Ivy League schools. System is not a monolithic structure. System is built with individuals such as you and me, and especially individuals such as you and me who have had the privilege of very good education. So we have to recognize that as individuals, we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to decide whether we want to simply perpetuate the system or do we disrupt it. See, there are no passive bystanders in this process. See, either you perpetuate a system or you disrupt it. And so that's where the choice is ours, that do we disrupt a system that we are in disagreement with because, again, we are outraged by what the system is doing with its culture of oppression and so on, by disrupting it with the values that we wish to bring it in. Or we simply become passive bystanders, by which I mean we are instrumental, we are agencies in perpetuating that system. So we have to get away, again, from this polarized dynamic of simply attributing stagnation to systems. Systems are not, see, completely aloof. They're part of us, and we are part of it.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for this discussion, and I wish this could go on all day. I really, really hate to just cut us off here. But let's think about, how we can further the conversation. Please, share your ideas There are so many, I mean, I have like 20 more questions to ask to each one of you. So please, everyone on this, in this gathering, share your ideas on like how we can further this conversation. And we are just diving, wetting our toes into the ocean. So thank you so much again for being here. And with that, I guess we will move on to our next presenter, who's Jim Wharton. He's the Director of Conservation, Engagement, and Learning at Seattle Aquarium. And just like what Amelia said, like what we do affects 7 generations ahead of us. And we actually have the same sentiment in our culture, the culture that I grew up with, that we believe that our actions now have an effect 7 generations past and 7 generations future, including the environment and the sentient and insentient beings that are around us. So with that, I would like to leave the floor to Jim. Thanks so much for being here, Jim. And Jim is also one of the participants to the first Dalai Lama Summit. So it's good to see you again.
Thank you, Elif. Apologies for interrupting that amazing panel. Hopefully our conversation will bring something of value as well. It's always exciting when everything you hear throughout the course of the day sort of reinforces and forces you to change the way you're thinking about the material you're presenting or the work that you're doing. So I always find these summits so invigorating from the very beginning when we met back in India. So greetings from the Pacific Northwest. I'm Jim Wharton. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the Director of Conservation Engagement and Learning at the Seattle Aquarium. So when we think about empathy, and at its core, think about it as perspective taking. It's not controversial. In fact, we've already talked about it quite a bit this morning to say that it's easier for us typically to empathize with someone whose life experience is similar to ours, and then more difficult to empathize with someone whose life experiences are quite different. In fact, this is a common criticism of empathy, right? That it cues us to think about and engage with that which we are already very familiar or that we can relate to. In fact, there's a really interesting blog about this on the nonprofit AF blog, Vu Lee's blog, if you're familiar with it. I put the link in our bookshelf, so you should check that out. It's an interesting conversation about whether, empathy is an equitable construct for fundraising, and it talks about some of these criticisms. So if in fact it is difficult for us to empathize with people whose lives are different from ours, then how difficult is it to empathize with non-human animals, which we certainly think of as having lives very different from ours? And as I heard Amelia use the term non-human animals, I use very specifically because, pro tip, we're all animals and we're really not that different. But I'd like to do a quick activity. And so I had put a link into the chat a little bit earlier, but you can also reach it like this. So I'd like, I see a couple of you have already dipped into this. I'd like you to open a new window or use your mobile device and go to the website pollev.com/Seattle Aquarium. And when you get there, what I'd like you to do is follow the example of the folks who've already participated. And I want you to move these animals in your ranking up or down so that the animals that are easiest to empathize with are at the top and the animals that are most difficult to empathize with are at the bottom. And what I want you to do is I want you to think about this from the perspective of, say, the general American public. Because of course, we know that cultures have incredibly diverse ways of looking at animals, but think about this from the general American public, not y'all are very enlightened, but and I realize that's still very broad, but stick with me and do the best you can, and let's see how this all shakes out. Now, in case it's a little confusing, I want to make sure that you understand the pictures that you're looking at. We, of course, have an elephant, a cat, a domestic chicken, a shark, a freshwater turtle, and that other picture down there is a group of barnacles. And so as you all are putting in those links, it's interesting to see how these things change. So we can see the elephant's got a little bit of purchase near the top, as does the cat. Sharks are certainly something that people have really strong feelings about, emotional connections to, both positive and negative. Turtles, barnacles, if you're not familiar with the barnacle, it's probably very difficult to understand where you where you might put it in your ranking? So this collection, or the way that this ranking has played out, is interesting, and it's very typical. So we've done this kind of activity with zoos and aquariums and museums all across the country as part of empathy workshops that we offer. And it often plays out very similarly to this. Mammals are first 100% of the time. Invertebrates and, well, this might call them more aversive animals like sharks or snakes, usually end up near the bottom. Animals that people keep as pets are often ranked a little bit higher, as are animals that we perceive to be intelligent, so like the elephant. Cultural connotations often complicate people's rankings. So food animals sometimes are ranked lower because some people feel like they need to disconnect themselves from an animal that they're going to eat. And then animals that have symbolic connotations, like say eagles in the United States, are sometimes ranked higher, even though that symbolism has nothing to do with perspective taking. So when we think about and we look at the research around the characteristics that typically engender empathy for animals and people, some patterns emerge. People seem to typically be able to empathize more easily with animals that demonstrate agency, affectivity, coherence, and continuity. So agency just means that an animal takes an action to meet its needs. So it eats or it plays or it grooms. People see this and they can relate to it. I do that. Affectivity is, in a person, might be your body language, might be your facial expressions. That works for some animals, but for the most part, people tend to substitute activity for affectivity. And I thought it was really interesting in Susan's presentation this morning, people even do it with lines. Lines on the way up are active and happy. Lines on the way down are sad and depressed. Likewise with animals, an animal that's active is happy and healthy. An animal that is more sedentary is sad or depressed. Now, coherence just means that it looks like an animal. And so it has arms or legs, it has a face. You may never have been presented with a pangolin before in your life, but when you see a pangolin, you immediately accept it as an animal. Sea anemone, on the other hand, is another story. Sea anemone looks as much like a flower as it does an animal. And in fact, it's named for a flower. And interestingly, when you Google search this particular image, the alt text that comes with it reads close-up of a flower. So even the AI was fooled in this particular instance. Now, the last characteristic there is continuity, and that just is the time that we spend with animals. So the more time we spend with animals, the more we believe that we can empathize with them. It's why we feel we understand completely what our pets are thinking. Now, people can easily observe these characteristics in more charismatic animals, like say your sea otters. It's more difficult for them to see them in other animals, but you can use these characteristics strategically to help people empathize with them. So if you look at the two animals on the screen, they both have arms and a mouth. In the sea anemone's case, the arms are in a ring around a mouth in the center. When you touch them gently, those sticky arms will wrap around your finger because they're stinging you. That's either out of protection or maybe because you might be food. But even with those few strokes, you can demonstrate the anemone's agency, its affectivity, and a bit of its coherence. Now, likewise, maybe these characteristics can also help us fill some of the gaps we might be experiencing in the way that we feel empathy for each other. So when there are individuals or communities with which we find ourselves having difficulty feeling empathy, we can ask ourselves, what are their needs? And how do they meet those needs? And am I misinterpreting their agency? Am I listening? Am I observing? Do I understand their affectivity? Am I open to correcting my misconceptions? You know, ultimately, we're all human animals. If it's so easy for me to see myself in a sea otter, why am I having so much difficulty seeing myself in another person? And then finally, is my discomfort a product of my unfamiliarity? Have I spent time with this person or in their community? So when we look at everything that's going on in the world right now, fostering empathy for animals may feel like a luxury, but the good news is that the neurological pathways are the same. So when we practice empathy for animals, we're also working the same muscles, and it helps us become more empathetic towards people. We've seen this happen in our workshops over the course of just a few hours. And so non-human animals provide an interesting gateway to empathy for people who may be struggling with it. I'd love to talk more about this idea with folks at this summit now and in the future. You can also touch base with any of my colleagues at the Woodland Park Zoo, Point Defiance, or Oregon zoos. And that's everything I have, Elif, and thank you all for your attention, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Jim. I know that we sort of extended into your time, so I would like to ask Greg to see if he can maybe direct a few questions from our chat.
Yes, thanks so much, Elif. Jim, your comment came in. Would a blind person empathize more with a flower that doesn't have eyes or a face than someone able to see it? Same as a deaf person. Just wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Well, that's interesting. One of the effective practices that we share about developing empathy is providing a rich sensory experience. So if you can see what an animal sees, smell what an animal smells, taste what an animal tastes, you're in a better position to be able to empathize with that animal. So I would say that that idea of having a rich sensory input is always going to be better for anybody to be able to empathize with any living thing.
Fascinating, thank you. And Michelle comments that it's actually interesting to me that people who spend most of their time with animals can show less empathy for humans. Wonder what your thoughts are about that. That might be getting a little too close to your territory.
No, not at all. I think that sometimes people go into animal fields because they have difficulty dealing with people, and so you hear that a lot. That I feel more comfortable around animals, or they can watch a movie where people are victims of violence, but if an animal is a victim of violence, so they can't watch that. And I would just say that that's a matter of balance. Just like we might use animals to help us become more empathetic for people, I think that can benefit in a lot of ways. It's certainly something that, just like any other form of empathy, it's about practice and balance.
Thanks so much. And I know we've got some other comments, but we'll keep an eye on them. Elif, I'll turn it back over to you so we can introduce our next presenter.
Thank you again. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Greg. And so our next presenter is Danielle Kretek-Cobb. She is the founder and principal of Google Empathy Lab. And she's going to share with us her experience and journey in a technology, in one of the biggest technology firms, as an advocate of empathy. And if Danielle, are you available now to take the floor?
Yep, I'm here.
Perfect.
Let's make sure that technology is my friend right now. You never know.
And I know that you have a video to show us too, so looking forward to it.
I do, yes. Actually, you know what? It says that host disabled attendee screen sharing. So I was about to share my screen. Sorry, guys.
Oh, that's okay.
Go to now. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Here we go. Perfect. Of course, the Google person has a little snag. Very good. Okay. Great. So when I tell people what my job is, they're like, what do you do? And I'm like, I work at Google Empathy Lab. It's a bit of a great brain scrambler. Google and empathy don't always go directly together, particularly perhaps now at this moment in time. But I've been doing this for about 6 years. I've been at Google for 8. But really, to put it kind of pithily, I speak human at the AI table. I'm part of the Google AI group. I was part of the design group looking after all of hardware. And really, they speak engineering and computational neuroscience and algorithms and machine learning and training data. And amidst that conversation and within that conversation, I really speak about our true nature as human beings, about empathy, curiosity, awe, wonder, and even more importantly, kind of messiness and vulnerability and mistakes. So really, when I think about it, it's kind of more Jane Goodall than it is, and kind of Franz de Waal's biological empathy that I talk about in my work, the things that never change, more than it is kind of sentient robots who sense when you're feeling down and deliver comfort food to you via a drone or something. So more kind of the things that are always true within us. And for me, just to be kind of honest with you guys, the battle at Google and in so much of technology is this cult worship of the brain, and this kind of amusing belief that there really is an answer for everything, that the mind and technology especially kind of can be applied to solve all of our problems, that things are better when they're faster or more efficient or predictable or replicable. I know as scientists, that's a good thing to kind of know what truth is, but in some ways it really squeezes out the margins of our humanity. So their holy grail is to engineer the vulnerability out, which in some ways is directly the contradiction of my work. So I really try with the Empathy Lab to hold a place for the mystery and the mystical human heart, our feelings, our intuitions, our relationships, our trust, and most importantly, our invisible connections with each other. We try to help people remember inside of themselves, everyone walks into these rooms to make these things as human beings with families and feelings. So really tapping themselves and the experiences that they share to not leave that at the door, but really to get into that deeper wiring that breathes us, that beats our hearts, that makes babies smile in their sleep, that makes us share in these moments of belonging, and help them find ways to actually trust that part of themselves, to trust the heart again, which is really kind of the soul of the usness, the togetherness, these invisible kind of common spaces of being. By the way, that's my daughter, who's 5 months old. I didn't even realize babies smiled in their sleep before. So that's my other empathy experiment. But to put it scientifically too, because I'm always walking the line, doing the dance of the space of the heart, the space of the mind, is the deeper resonances that lie in these origins of sociality, an ode to the kind of vagus nerve and all that study does, and really just using science and research to make the case for engineering vulnerability in rather than out. I love this quote: "I can always rely on Einstein to be a bridge and someone that an engineer won't argue with." But this quote of, "I never made one of my discoveries with my rational mind. The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant." We've heard so many riffs of this before. But I think the bridges of science and soul in my work are my greatest allies, like this gentleman who for 50 years since Be Here Now has taught us how to remember the heart again. This, of course, is Ram Dass, and I'm blessed because this being is my spiritual friend, to use the Buddhist term. But he's already walked this path, moving from science to spirit and doing it in a way that others can follow, really, bridging the gap between Harvard and the Himalayas. So this is a film that we made together that's about the journey from the head to the heart.
Spiritual trip at this moment is not necessarily a cave in the Himalayas, but it's in relation to the technology that's existing. It's relation to where we're at. It's in relation to issues like pollution and political interests and activism and stuff like that. I think that's all part of one package now. The game is to be where you are, be it honestly and as consciously as you know how.
I don't know about you, but I've been sort of wondering what's happening these days. What is this moment about? Some people feel there is a sense of change in the air. I guess it depends on where you're looking at it from. We are functioning still under the myth that the rational mind is more user-friendly than the intuitive heart mind. We got so enamored of the power of our analytic mind because look, we can go to the moon. We've cracked the genetic code. Our astronomers now can look back to the beginning of time. Our technology is so advanced it makes Star Trek obsolete. We're suddenly all privy to everything.
We live very much in our minds. One of the powers you and I have is the power of this intellect. Because it turns out that the intellect is only one way of knowing the world.
There's this other part of you related to the heart, which has no boundary to it.
It doesn't know the universe through objective means. It doesn't know the universe dualistically. It doesn't know the universe about thinking about something. It is one with it. But it isn't as if we have to choose one versus the other. We've got both of them. We are at wise person training.
Science and its products must be tempered with wisdom. It is not a substitute for wisdom. This moment has in it the fear, the possibility, the end, the beginning. It has the sadness, the hope, the hopelessness. And if you're afraid of change, you are going to be part of the problem. And if you can say, here we go, you could be part of the solution.
What could it possibly mean to transform the world? Transformation doesn't begin with an institution. We don't organize to transform the universe. We start with the individual human heart. It takes only one heart to start the whole chain.
The lesson in this incarnation is to love. To love.
So like Ram Dass says, we start with the individual human heart. And when we're doing our work and we're working with our product people and our engineers and our data scientists, it's really just starting with the anchor there and then moving on into the rest of the process. But really, how do we work with the heart? How do we help technology folks that are very much in their minds and deep in code and in this kind of entrainment with the machines remember, and really it's to speak that language. Some of the Empathy Lab tricks, which we, talk about as design feeling, which is kind of a riff on or a layer added to design thinking, is to speak these languages. And Frank Capra said that we have universal human languages. He talked about math, music, and film. But for us, the feeling languages are film and music and art and nature. I love the aliens from Spielberg's Close Encounters, because when he talked about this film, and I love also that someone did the Pantone chip coding below it. These are our people. But he talked about how, if it was a really advanced species that could get here, they're going to know that they need to speak to their audience. They're going to know that humans are emotional creatures and you can't just spit out math and science. You need to engage them with the languages of the heart, which in this case are color and light. And so I love those glowing tones. So when, nature and art for me, and for most of you, it's why it's so wonderful to be in this circle with all of you speaking these languages. together are the most powerful feeling languages. They're profound vessels of truth beyond beauty, and they really carry so much in terms of the lessons on seeing and being. So when I first started working in AI, I was obsessed with using the daylight spectrum actually to communicate presence and intelligence, to work with that language and carry it through and inside. Light's a powerful language of attention and brightening and care. And so, you know, to learn well, I of course turned to the wisdom of the light painters. So Turrell and Olafur Eliasson. And I also turned to my friend, a designer and illustrator, Jeff McFetridge, to help me, you know, find and kind of locate in the feeling realm a design philosophy for AI by drawing our way through it rather than thinking our way through it, just literally taking a different path. So we drew a book called Feeling Our Way to AI, which I love this one. It's one of my favorite illustrations. And this is a new way of working for design and technology, you know, of bringing the feelings in. That's why we call it design feeling. But it says these feelings in all of your being matter and belong here. There aren't things that you're not supposed to talk about, that there's nothing outside the process or outside the door. Your messiness, your imperfection, your personal beliefs, your experience in whatever it is you're walking around in the shoes of yourself, the shape of you is your gift. And this is what you offer to the people that you make for. So people talk about design often as a service, the service industry of design. And actually we think of it as service, as devotional service itself. So it isn't a service, it is service, that you are really one heart serving another heart, that your empathy is your secret weapon in that, not your ability to calculate or outsmart or squeeze the mystery or humanity out so it's all the known scientific universe. I went to visit the Jet Propulsion Lab earlier this year because I work with them on some stuff. And, you know, even the NASA engineers don't squeeze that out. They have poetry on the walls of the JPL. I love this quote from Dame Manoush Shafiq from the London School of Economics, who says, in the past jobs were about muscles, now they're about brains, and in the future they'll be about the heart. I feel like why all of the work that we're talking about here and everyone who's gathered, the beauty of these deep contributions, particularly in this moment, these are the languages that matter the most for the future. These are the ones our young people need to be nurtured and enlivened by and fluent in, to have the mother tongue stay within the heart. In tech, they talk a lot about STEM and why that's so important for everyone to be able to speak the universal language of math. But the future isn't code, it's connection. It's this loving awareness of others. The future of experiences and interaction design can carry that empathetic signature. It's challenging, but it's one person caring deeply for the feelings and well-being of another. So my hope in the work of the lab is to hope that technology can speak this language of the heart if all of us are more committed to doing it ourselves, because almost like the fingerprint in the pot of someone who, you know, drinks from a cup or from that pot down the line, you feel the signature of the person who made it. So the idea is to be true to that earlier in the process, and so that can be kind of felt on the other side. So that's our hope and what we work on a little each day at the Empathy Lab. And thanks for listening and for your attention right now.
Thank you so much, Danielle. This was wonderful, and what a great video. Thank you for sharing with us. And I would like to actually segue into a question for you. And so, I mean, we have seen so far, this is our first day of our gathering, but you are familiar with the project through Carlene's Empathy Center at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. That's how we met, actually. So my question is, you know, how can we bring museums and what takes place in museums in terms of our explorations of empathy and empathy building into the development of these new technologies and designs? Because it seems like there's an ecosystem that is waiting to be sort of like, I mean, maybe there are like little connections already here and there, but I feel like there has to be a more robust sort of pipeline of these, you know, ideas exchange and learning from, let's say, you know, as Jim is learning in, you know, Seattle Aquarium about, you know, why we do not empathize with barnacles, but we empathize with elephants. How could that be? How do you see that information in the work that you do? And how do you, I mean, find it useful? And what are some of the ways to create these exchanges, because mostly in museums, when we think about technology, is we tend to like we are the clients of those firms, right? We use their systems and services and products to convey the mission of our institution, for example. But we are talking about another thing, right? Museums as incubators of empathy building. So please, if you can share with us your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny. I always talk about how I am just a thief from, I will take feelings and things that kind of bring any machine for feeling that I will borrow into my process. So if it's film, if it's art, if it's, for me, it's always the referential kind of circle you can put around a person as they're beginning to design a product or an experience, or as they're looking at developing the training data for something, is the thing that's most going to influence what it ends up as on the other side. So I think what's interesting is you're right. It's so easy to think of technology as the kind of end point, or that, like you said, the client relationship that is already a partnership with technology and museums or experiences or experiential places. But I think taking it way far upstream into the beginning of the process, I mean, like Jim was talking about, it's like the richer the sensory experiences, the better the chance for empathy. And I think what's great too is when I think about the folks I work with, I mean, I was like scribbling down tons of notes around what it means to be in the practice of empathy with non-human animals because of the benefits and gifts of that when you're with the human animals. And we need those helpful leaps and that hand holding to actually, because the thing is when you're connected to your heart, when you kind of drop from the mind into the heart, there's a disarming process that happens where the shields go down and you're more open to actually being in that part of your being. So I can imagine being, at the aquarium or at the zoo and working through something that allows people to tap into something that you then immediately take in a kind of applied empathy way into whatever the process is. And it's like the study, one of the things I remember learning from another partner that's here, the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, was how teachers that would write something positive or that could name the feeling they were having before they graded papers were more accurate in their grading. So I just think of these design feeling actually as a practice is meant to not be something totally new. It's meant to be the little thing you do for 2 to 5 minutes before you start the thing you already know how to do, that just changes it all because you've gone from here to here, because you've pulled in some of your humanity or experience, because you've had a connection and the feelings are bubbling up in you for that little otter, and may we all grow to deep otter-like empathy with the anemones and the barnacles. And I think, Venerable Tenzin too was talking about how do humans learn values. I know that so many of my values were kind of installed by beautiful curation at exhibits in art museums. My mom was an artist. My grandmother was an artist. I went to art museums a ton as a child. And it was like the way that a story is told, the way that it unfolds inside of you because of beautiful curation, regardless of the experience you're having, that is the birthplace of feelings and narratives that people can apply elsewhere. So I just feel like the partnerships, and I'm so open to this could potentially be one of my commitments with you guys, is how can we take exercises from your worlds and begin to apply them into our process. I think we were just desperate to help our folks get outside of kind of the whiteboard walls of their minds. It's so easy, we can't help but just, they get into the places of their strengths and their superpowers because they think that's what's going to serve people the best, that my smartest self, my best self will serve. And in fact, it's your weakest, most vulnerable moments that are probably the things that everyone else is like, me too, those magic words, me too. So I feel like those types of partnerships and pioneering those is a deep space for far more connected stuff to come through. We really want the technology to disappear, and we want everything, at its very basic with machine learning to be fair. But what really starts to look like a potential of a warmer, more kind of porous and breathing future with technology where it doesn't have us in its grip, that's possible when you start to speak these languages. So I think being the teacher and the educator of these languages is where all this stuff comes in.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And I think, I think this is very important because, as more and more museums are undertaking, empathy and empathy building, once they start looking into, yes, we want to build empathy because we know that our society needs it, it becomes immediately an internal issue. The institution starts looking into itself and tries to come to terms with their own values and how they are set up, who's sitting around the table, who's on the board, all those things come into play. But and I think all this is just the signs of a great lab, right? I mean, we are on the journey. Empathy journey is being experienced in museums right now. So what other industries can learn from this experience? And what museums can learn from the other industries, such as technology, healthcare, judiciary system, law, and many other aspects of our lives, so that as we are designing and learning ourselves, how can we design better products that serve to these greater needs, right? It's a true sign of true collaboration, I think, in that way. And I think at least this requires at least three legs, right? I mean, an academic institution, an industry partner, and maybe a museum. And if museums can step up to this space, I believe this space will be theirs because they have been doing this forever. It's just that it has been unnoticed and gone out to the ether as like a byproduct of a museum experience. But now that we know that we really need empathy and we really need to understand what empathy is, what are the pitfalls, what are the potential, and what other partners we need, to make it more perfect. So that, as I said in the beginning, this is not the tree that we want to build. This is just a seed that we are trying to understand what we are messing with here, right? It's just a seed that we are trying to unfold. And hopefully, if we can all do our part by being present at the moment and just turn our ideas and intentions into action, hopefully we'll be able to create that ground where these seeds can flourish and ultimately lead to the compassionate presence that Venerable Priyadarshi mentioned, and love. Greg, are there any questions that you would like to ask Danielle?
Well, I think, as we've said before, we could have an entire couple of more hours just on this conversation and many good thoughts coming in. Elif, as you're talking, I'm thinking, maybe 20 years ago when I came into the field, we weren't talking about empathy in museums, but we certainly were talking about the visitor experience and what museums offer that is unique. Certainly there have been leading researchers in our field like John Falk and Lynn Deerking who propose a contextual model of learning, which is deeply embedded in that sociocultural context, what we do on our own, how we engage with our families, our communities, and what museums can do to help bring that along by providing a physical context and personal context for that kind of learning. So I think there's lots of ways, and I know there are many of my museum colleagues in the audience right now who are either nodding or want to jump into this conversation. And so a comment that came in a little bit ago, talking about going from right brain to left brain. How do we make that leap when so much of that leap is about language and the words we use? And how does that become a barrier? How do we circumnavigate that barrier?
For me to answer?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, just checking. There's so many people that could answer that in a really illuminating way. I would say in my practice at Google, and it's challenging too. It's not that it's like when you're giving a presentation, it's like, oh, fantastic. It's like Rambas and drawings. It is, it is a daily grind of the heart, like the real work on a daily basis. I think the like you said, language is a big deal. Elif, you nodded to almost happens is you could call it institutional flooding, which is you want to start the conversation around empathy or bringing in these, the shapes of yourself that you normally kind of pretend aren't there. And then it's like when that boundary softens, how do you have a courageous conversation in a comfortable, honest, appropriate way? Because we're not used to doing that stuff at work. We're used to kind of pretending in a different way. So how do you keep everyone safe is the first thing. How do you create a safe container where parts of us that we didn't think were welcome can show up? How do you help people have the kinds of conversations where you are in these practices of empathy, of perspective taking, of just good listening? I mean, the funniest thing I found is in a culture where everyone wants to have the best answer, listening really suffers because you're so in your own head trying to know or to be seen to know, that no one really listens. And so what I found is just good listening. It's all the basics. It's all the sort of super basics. But that's where I think these higher fidelity kind of more sensory immersive experiences in these contextual environments, like you're talking about, learning being in context is so much richer and gets kind of installed in all the levels. But for, I think that's the magic trick, is the right language and the right almost metaphoric or contextual experience where you say, let's feel this thing over here in this safe place because it's a zoo or an aquarium, or it's listening to the words of a great teacher, or someone like, Venerable Tenzin, who people can listen in a different way. It's like we have so many different sets of ears. It's almost like, how can you use one set of your ears, or how can you talk about their family life or an experience they had in childhood, or how do we borrow from these other places and then make a direct line back into where they know how to bring that in? And I think that applied empathy piece is so important because it's easy to get flooded. Not everybody loves personal growth work. It's uncomfortable. There's a reason why it isn't the way that everyone's used to. So I think just keeping it into really baby steps and giving them, you feel this thing and you immediately can put it over here versus like getting into some spiral of process. Those are the ways, the keeping it safe, keeping everybody kind of in the same place, where when you tell a story from your childhood, or if you're all responding to kind of the beluga whale that dances with the mariachi band, it's a safe place for everybody to be in. So yeah. I hope that was a little more Hemingway than haiku, but I hope that makes sense.
No, it was lovely. And I think what you described, and we'll wrap this conversation up, what you described is very much indicative of the point of inflection where museums find themselves right now. Makeba, you talked about it earlier. I know folks, Jim, you're talking about it. Micah Parzan, you're in the audience, you're dealing with it at your institution. All of us really grappling with this moment that, and not even a problem, but really a moment of opportunity to think differently about what we do. So Danielle, thank you. And really all of our presenters today, thank you. So I want to, two quick things for us as we come to the last handful of minutes of our time together. The first is, Elif, I know that you are primarily responsible for this program, but if you had to sum up your key takeaways from what we've explored today, all variations on a theme, what might those key takeaways be?
Thank you. Thank you again for everybody for being here and for sharing their thoughts and expertise. And I think my key takeaways would be, that empathy's definition is evolving. That is, I think that's an accurate statement that we can make. I mean, from all of our conversations, we are approaching it from many different perspectives. And it's, I think, underlying intent under our work in empathy is actually just bringing up love to surface, right? But love is such a sort of big amorphous thing. I think empathy at least gives us a sort of a scientific or more sort of a concrete place, not that it is concrete at all, but to begin, sort of unfolding and analyzing. But the intent is to reach love, right? A love of other human beings, the environment, each other, our universe, and our place in it. and technology has a lot to do with it, as we are just now developing these technologies. We are learning, we are projecting our existing values and ethics and thoughts and emotions into the design of these products. Pretty soon they will start dictating our lives. So it will be through like seeing ourselves in the mirror effect, right? Like, now, do you like me now? Like, you created me, and I'm here at your service. But so we are at that very moment where we have this opportunity to interject and maybe do our best, really, whatever we can. We don't have the tools to sort of command the outcome. All we can hope and do is do something now. Just don't be a bystander. And so oneness is important, as a context. The empathy is evolving meaning, capaciousness, as Susan put it. And then as Camilo showed us that, there are many ways to get at it. And then with these products, and our panelists also touched upon, the language, the processes, and the products can all help us get there. But at the end of the day, I really believe that we have to do away with these silos, that, like technologists work amongst themselves. And I know that this is happening to a certain degree, but we really need to be radical and really do whatever we can at this very moment to break down those silos so we can get this discussion open and out. So it is intentional. We are calling it a name. We want more empathy so that it can lead to love. And then this is what we are doing. And as many speakers mentioned, this is a contagious thing and it catches up. And that's how we are here, right? I mean, a couple of years ago, this was just like piece of thought, a few words for me on a piece of paper. And look where we are now, thanks to all of you. So with that, I would like to segue into our the first summit that took place in 2018. As Danielle mentioned, that creating safe spaces are important for these ideas and sharings to come out. And I believe we were successful at that event to have that kind of space where at the end of the day, our last day in India, in a beautiful Buddhist temple, we were expected to share our commitments with each other. So I would like to open the floor to anyone who participated in the 2018 summit to share a few words and maybe give us a quick, status report about their commitments. How is that going, and what could we do to help, perhaps? So maybe you can raise your hand. I guess this is what we can do, or you can just, raise your hands. And maybe Greg will call upon you, or me, if I can see everybody. Let me see, I have to change my view. Now I can see more of you. Anybody interested in sharing? I feel like a teacher now. Jim, please, thank you.
I don't mind jumping in. So, one of our commitments is to bring the sort of circle of thought into some of the work that we're doing at the aquarium. So one of the things we're trying to do is reimagine what an outreach vehicle for an aquarium looks like. Instead of a box of live animals that you take and then take the animals out of the box and then show them to people, we thought there could be a more transformative empathy experience with animals in an outreach setting like that. So we are in process, and my commitment had been to bring this group into that design process. Unfortunately, certain factors have delayed that process. So we're still intending to do that. The other commitment that we made was to also think about how we could expand the Zoo and Aquarium Workshop program that we had developed to museum settings similarly delayed by certain circumstances. So our commitments remain strong, and we still are excited to bring, and with even more people at the summit this year, there are even more minds to bring into the conversation. So I'm excited for what the future will bring with that.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you so much.
Can I jump in?
Please, Wendy.
I had 3 commitments. The first one was a pretty easy one. Mine was, the first one was to convene all of the folks in New York which I did in January of 2019. And Leaf, you were there. The second one was to actually reach out to some of my colleagues, because what I learned was that you have to kind of have the ripple effect and engage with more people. And I asked my school and teacher programs people at MoMA if they would be interested in learning more about the C curriculum that the Dalai Lama and Emory University created, which was being launched in Delhi. And I managed to weasel a way to get all three of them equally, not just the chief person, but everybody to Delhi to participate in that. And since then, they have actually built connections with teachers in the New York City public schools and done a huge amount of work in kind of being the gift that keeps on giving. And just recently, my third one was actually to see whether our Coursera courses could actually take some of this work into the fold and to have a larger scale. But with the pandemic, everybody went digital very easily, and my team actually started collaborating across areas, and they have been doing something called mindful practices for well-being, and doing videos about kind of empathetic types of skills that you could build by looking skills and slow looking. And just last week, even taking it even further, they connected with folks from Stanford and with the UN and WHO, and did a teacher workshop online of art and science of hope and justice, which brought together people from all over the world, which was super exciting. And to see how actually just using the technology is a way of connecting with people. So I no longer am at MoMA. I retired, as some of you know, but I am looking for my next commitments at the end of this session. So.
Thank you, Wendy. So, and I see we have 5 minutes, so maybe one or two more people. And I would please encourage the 2018 summiters to please go ahead and use the commitments form, because I mean, as you know, we collected them as a notes, and Ruth, unfortunately, she couldn't be here. She collected our meeting notes the last day. But if you could please go ahead and enter them in, and we'll organize and come back with it to you.
Elif, I can chime in here. I honestly can't remember what I wrote down, but what I do know is that I committed to being a host and collaborating with you to bring this summit to the Phillips Collection last year. And I'm so delighted that we were able to do that. And it was amazing. And to see this event even go beyond that is filling this heart space for me in a way that I hadn't imagined. So that one commitment I did do. Another thing that I at least verbally said, I don't know if I wrote it, but it was to begin where I am. We're looking around, what is my calling? How can I make impact? How can I really embody these values around empathy? And I said, it starts with me, and it also starts in my home. I'm a mature mother to an 8-year-old who is very curious, who asks a lot of good questions, but questions that just blow my mind. And so I've begun doing, for the last 8 months to a year, working and investing in her and her cohort of friends, and even some of the teachers in her school in Montgomery County in Maryland, around these ideas of empathy and compassion in the classroom, social inclusion. This is the language that she and her colleagues, whatever they're called, classmates at that age, are learning right now, and they're practicing it. And it's beautiful to see that reinforcement from home to in the community, in the classroom. The third thing that I'll say is that I have been, and maybe this is this early midlife thing that I'm going through, been thinking about how I can be more intentional around my calling, not just as a leadership expert in the DEAI space, but I come to this work by way of my faith. I am a Christian. I don't proselytize per se, but it's that love. It's that empathy and love that feeds directly into my work. And that is a unique fingerprint that I have to help heal. And I'm a healer. I heal in spaces that I'm called to. Right now, I'm called to a space in the arts and culture arena that is asking each of us to pull the veil off and to say, how can I, from wherever I sit in an institution or in a community, be impactful? How can I lead from my sphere of influence, whether I am sweeping the floors or putting up an exhibition? I'm helping people say, I can do something. I can see myself as part of the change because I feel empowered, because I feel like I belong. And in spaces where I sense very deeply and intuitively that people are not feeling that sense of connection and belonging, I am purposely and with love, but with great intention, disrupting those spaces. This is such a critical moment. Elif, I'm grateful for the gift that you keep giving us of convening and everybody else who keeps showing up to your call, because it's really important that we each use our sphere of influence to impact, create change, to open up. We're all waking up. 7, 8 months ago, if you were asleep then, you are fully awake now. So many overwhelming challenges. Think about what can you do from your sphere of influence, wherever that is, by first putting that mirror right here at that beautiful face that you wake up to every morning. Thank you so much for this gift.
Makiba, I cannot think of any better way to conclude today. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you everyone for being here. I won't say any other words. I'll see you tomorrow again at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Until then.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much, Arif.